Anja is a mushroom. His lifelong mission is to raise his own spore. But one day, he lost his spore. He searched all over the world for a long time and finally saw his familiar spore on the news. Anja desperately knocked on the door of a certain colonel of the human military. "Hello, sir. After you finish your research, can you please give my son back to me?" In 2030, the Earth's magnetic field disappeared. Without protection, the Earth was destroyed by solar radiation. PIN-YE instruments malfunctioned. Industry came to a halt, all signals disappeared, and humanity faced a major blackout. Skin diseases and cancer brought by cosmic rays were killing humans. But this wasn't the worst result. Genetic pollution was the start of the nightmare. This pollution appeared among all living things. The higher the pollution index, the faster the gene conversion rate. Soon, humanity fell into a great survival crisis. 13 years later, humans built artificial magnetic poles. They attempted to use this weak magnetic field to block cosmic rays and solar wind. Humans also began to build bases around the magnetic poles, but the danger remained. In a certain abyss, a group of humans was being defeated by winged monsters. Facing the relentless monsters, they had no choice but to retreat hastily. Anja, in an effort to save his companions, was tripped by a vine and fell to the ground. However, it was clear that his companions chose to retreat over rescuing him, and Anja was left behind. As he watched his companions' backs in a daze, a bone spike pierced his chest from the darkness. Anja fell into the abyss in despair. After a long time, a vine dragged him into a cave. "When I die, eat this body. That way, it feels like I've done something meaningful." In the quiet cave, the little mushroom released mycelium that spread throughout Anja's body. These mycelium continuously attempted to repair the chest pierced by bone spurs. Under the effect of the mycelium, Anja finally managed to barely open his eyes. "Don't waste your effort. You don't need to stop my bleeding. You can't stop it." The little mushroom seemed not to hear and continued trying to repair the wound, also absorbing the blood that was flowing out. Having absorbed genes, the little mushroom quickly learned human language. It murmured the name of this man, Anja. Anja didn't expect it to learn human language so quickly. "It seems the pollution index here is really high. Since you've learned human language, when I die, you can eat this body. You'll gain even more then. In this way, it would seem like I've done something meaningful." In human society, Anja was a worthless man, so his companions could abandon him as they wished. However, he didn't expect to encounter such a gentle creature before dying. This could be considered a kind of compensation. Anja started coughing again, and with the cough, blood flowed through his fingers. The little mushroom also sensed that his life was rapidly fading. It comforted Anja to hang on, but Anja knew his body couldn't hold on any longer. "Stop wasting your energy. I can't go on anymore. This is my ID card, the pass to the human base. Within the human base, no alien can escape the eyes of the judge." The little mushroom thought Anja wanted him to go to the human base. But when Anja heard this, he got excited and started coughing again. "Don't go there. Only humans can enter the human base. No alien can escape the eyes of the judge." But the usually obedient little mushroom refused this time. He had a reason he had to go. His spores were taken by humans. At the place where he lost his spores, he only found a bronze-colored eggshell. Since picking up that eggshell, he never let it go. Death is most common in the abyss, but raising spores is the sole mission of all mushrooms in their lifetime. Anja's injury was getting worse. After coughing a few times, he struggled to lift his hand and touch the mycelium on his body, trying to persuade him to give up this idea. "You have no attack power and no defense. You're just a very small mushroom." After saying this, Anja closed his eyes. After An's death, Shao released billions of mycelium that entwined around him. These mycelium began to wrap around An's entire body. Slowly, a new body was born from these mycelium. This body was flawless. As one foot lightly stepped on the moss-covered ground, Anja opened his eyes. He turned his head to glance at An's skeleton, walked forward, and gently embraced it in his arms. "Ans, can I help you return?" Shao eventually changed into his clothing. He rifled through An's pack and took out a map. After glancing at the cartridge in his hand, Shao finally set off on the path to find the spores. Shao seemed to have no natural enemies. No creature would give him a second glance. But he was solely afraid of ants. According to the map, to reach the abandoned city, he needed to keep heading northeast, passing through the second plane. But Anja had not yet left the abyss. Along the way, he saw many scenes he had never heard of before. A pine tree bent its trunk to swallow a giant python with two tails. As he stared blankly at the scene before him, A canine creature with 6 eyes emerged from the bushes. Anja was too frightened to move, letting the creature inspect him thoroughly. However, it seemed uninterested in Anja and left with heavy steps after inspecting him. Various monsters inhabited this abyss, but they seemed uninterested in Anja as well, allowing him to proceed smoothly towards the northeast. He traveled day and night, transforming back into a mushroom to rest in the mud when tired, after several days and nights of continuous trekking. Finally, Anja arrived at plane number 2, his first visit to this place, which was starkly different from the abyss. It was very dry here, and Anja could no longer recover his strength as before. Consequently, he began to try the human method of recovery, sleeping. As he drifted off, a black figure appeared before him. The oppressive presence dispelled his drowsiness. The tremor deep in Anja's bones let him know that the creature before him was indeed his natural enemy, an ant. The little mushroom encountered a human, but why were his eyes filled with a desire to possess? Anja dodged swiftly, avoiding the ant's fatal blow. Unfortunately, one of his arms was still severed. One of his arms was cut off. He didn't dare hesitate any longer and quickly jumped towards the bushes ahead. The moment he leaped, countless mycelia erupted all over Anja's body. In the blink of an eye, the severed arm grew back. The next second after Anja hid in the bushes, he saw that the ant was instantly cut into several pieces. It's a human. He hadn't seen a human in a long time. When he stretched his head to take a closer look, 3 dark gun barrels were pointed at Anja's head. Anja immediately raised both hands. I surrender. Seeing Anja wasn't much of a threat, one of them took a puff and then started to scrutinize him more brazenly. I gotta say. But we still have to check the wound by the rules. Will you take off your clothes yourself, or should I help you? Anja didn't dare to move. Fortunately, another person stepped forward at this time. Hassan, don't act up in the wild. Anja, come with me. After saying that, he turned around and Anja closely followed him. Are you heading back to the northern base? The man in front answered casually as a reply. Can you take me with you? Faced with Anja's request, after some discussion, everyone decided to take him along if he hasn't mutated after they have collected the spoils of war. After introducing themselves to each other, Anja finally learned everyone's names. The leader of the group is called Vance, the one who asked him to undress is called Hassan, and the remaining man is called Anthony. The little mushroom, stepping out of the abyss for the first time, finds itself in a predicament. How will it escape this situation? The little mushroom took a dagger from Vance's hand and began to carefully cut the ant legs after putting on gloves. Then, the cut ant legs were neatly placed aside. At this moment, Hassan, who was supposed to be on lookout, came over and grabbed the little mushroom. The corners of his eyes blatantly scanned the lovely figure in front of him. Little treasure, don't puke from disgust. Vance noticed the little mushroom's predicament and chased Hassan away, for which the little mushroom was very grateful. He stepped forward wanting to help, but Vance, fearing he might get hurt, told him to just watch from the side. Standing aside, the little mushroom suddenly noticed dark red droplets on the ground. It seemed like the droplets also came from Anja's body. Could it be that someone was injured? After the spoils of war were collected, the little mushroom was arranged to stay in the outermost restroom, as the sound of the car engine roared to life. This journey headed for the northern base has officially begun. Little Mushroom was lying in the lounge when suddenly, he heard a conversation between Vance and Anthony in the cockpit. Listening to them, it seemed something was off with Anthony. He wanted to find out more, but the lounge was pitch black at the moment, and he couldn't see anything. Suddenly, Little Mushroom opened his eyes. He looked around confusedly as the door suddenly opened, and then he saw a hand reaching in. It was Hosen. Hosen kept approaching Little Mushroom. Little darling, I know you're all about not being able to drive, can't handle heavy weapons, your teammates surely can't be counting on you, right? I've seen plenty of scared little things like you before, but never one as pretty as you. In this apocalypse, there's no need to apologize to anyone for dying because the next moment, it could be you. Faced with Hosen's coercion, Little Mushroom quickly fumbled in his bag for the dagger Vance had given him. Hosen, his mind filled with desire, failed to notice his subtle movement. Even when there was a loud smashing sound coming from outside the lounge, he just thought Anthony couldn't wait any longer. A strong sense of urgency made Little Mushroom a bit dazed. The next instant, his pupils dilated, seemingly having seen something terrifying. From Little Mushroom's perspective, a half-human, half-monster creature was standing outside the hatch. After noticing it was spotted, the monster immediately bent down. Hassan suddenly realized that Little Mushroom beneath him was trembling all over. Was he pretending to be pitiful? Before he could ponder further, the little darling he thought he could easily control shot out countless mycelia. These mycelia interrupted Hassan and simultaneously opened the car door. Little Mushroom dared not delay. He immediately dragged Hassan and jumped out of the vehicle, but the monster had no intention of stopping and continued to chase closely behind Little Mushroom. Inside the car, Vance observed Little Mushroom jumping out and escaping through the surveillance. He frowned. He immediately turned the car around and drove toward Little Mushroom. While Little Mushroom was running away, he noticed Vance approaching him. He turned and ran toward the car. At the moment of contact, Vance grabbed Little Mushroom and pulled him into the vehicle. Then he immediately closed the car door. Little Mushroom wanted to ask about Hassan, but Vance turned the car around, indicating he couldn't be saved. Indeed, through monitoring, one can see the monster absorbing Hawthorne's brain. When life and death separations become the norm, death doesn't seem so frightening anymore. Vance seemed to guess what had just happened and casually asked, "Did Anthony mutate?" Upon hearing this, Little Mushroom couldn't help but lower his head. "I'm sorry, I saw blood on the ant carapace. If I had spoken up earlier." Vance interrupted him, "Anthony didn't turn into an ant. We even encountered a group of mutated mosquitoes earlier." Vance, who has been through countless life and death separations, has grown indifferent to these things. Anthony's death didn't matter to anyone in his eyes, he just wanted to go home, so he hid his injury. He knew he would be abandoned if he spoke up, so he preferred to take a chance. "What about Hawthorne then?" Upon hearing this, Vance's expression became even more indifferent. "Hawthorne's death is not unjust, he had at least 5 lives under his belt. If we really didn't need the manpower, I wouldn't have worked with him." "What was he doing then? Bullying you?" Little Mushroom turned his head, unwilling to mention it anymore. The vehicle quickly fell silent. After a while, Vance spoke again, "I have a brother about your age. We used to go out into the field together." Sure enough, this statement sparked Little Mushroom's curiosity again. He asked where the brother was now. "Dead," Vance replied. "Killed by a judge at the base entrance 2 months ago." Hearing the unfamiliar term judge, Little Mushroom was taken aback. His reaction made Vance curious about where he was from. As for Little Mushroom, he could only say that he didn't used to interact with people. Vance didn't ask further but still explained what this so-called judge was. Little Mushroom finally arrived at the northern base. "My husband has been waiting here for a long time. There is a system in the base called the Judge's Bill. Based on this system, an organization with high status called the Tribunal was established. The members of the Tribunal are called judges. The members of the Tribunal are called adjudicators. They usually rotate their duties at the base gate. Each one has a license to kill, and killing is not illegal." That day, Vance brought his younger brother back to the base gate. It seemed that luck was playing a joke on him. They encountered not an ordinary adjudicator but their boss, whom everyone called the judge. He took one look and shot the younger brother without any reason. Although Vance hated him, he had no means to retaliate. Because too many people in the base hated him, his hatred made no difference. He might even be shot dead by him someday. Little Mushroom was a bit panicked. He wanted to ask the judge if he could really identify all the anomalies. Facing this question, Vance fell silent for a moment before answering, "Dead men tell no tales. Better to kill by mistake than to let go. If a real anomaly mixed into the base, it would definitely be discovered. Only one anomaly attack incident happened this whole year." This response made Little Mushroom even more uneasy. He wiped the cold sweat that flowed due to his nervousness. He wanted to leave quietly and return to the wilderness filled with monsters. Although uncertain how long he could survive, it would definitely be longer than tomorrow. However, thinking that spores were more precious than life, he refrained from running away. Thus, Little Mushroom followed Vance all the way to the northern base. Little Mushroom's first encounter with his husband was when he was forcibly taken away in front of everyone. Little Mushroom followed Van closely and lined up at the back of the crowd. He looked around nervously. Surrounded by judges in black uniforms, Little Mushroom dared not look more and instinctively scattered. At that moment, his expression froze. Not far away, a man cleaning a gun caught his eye. The man had a pair of cool eyes. He also noticed Little Mushroom. The moment their eyes met, Little Mushroom saw the man raise his pistol. Van, seeing Little Mushroom not moving, turned his head to ask why. With a bang, a gunshot sounded, and Van fell to the ground. Little Mushroom finally knew who he was. This is the judge, the master of the tribunal. Whether human or mutant, he can decide the life and death of anyone, without needing a reason. Van is dead. Next, it would be his turn. Since coming to the northern base was my own decision, facing the trial was my own ending. No matter the outcome, I silently counted in my heart. I thought I would follow in Vance's footsteps at the 3rd count, but even at the 13th count, the judge across from me still made no move. Finally, the man holstered his gun and said to me, "Follow me." I hung my head low and silently waited for him to move first, but the person in front of me remained still. I lifted my head, full of confusion. Why isn't he moving? The man's voice grew colder. Stretch out your hands, he said. Obediently, I extended my hands, only to see the judge across from me pull out a pair of handcuffs and click them shut around my wrists. Then, under the watchful eyes of everyone, he led me towards the tribunal. The obedient and cute little mushroom meets the cold and ruthless Colonel Liu. What kind of sparks could fly between us? I found humans truly strange. While the judge executed Vance, no one spoke a word. Now that the judge was leaving, everyone gathered around Vance's body, whispering amongst themselves. The judge led me through the city gates. Defensive installations are visible everywhere within the city. Nearby, several judges are interrogating a man. Where is your wife? Did she leave the city with you this time? Through Anne's memory, Little Mushroom realized that the memories of the infected could be affected. Thus, interrogation is also one of the methods for identification. The man took Little Mushroom to a door. He then pulled out a walkie-talkie, Tribunal, Liu. Requesting genetic testing. As soon as he finished speaking, the iron door opened in response. Liu Feng, holding Little Mushroom, entered. The room was filled with various unidentifiable objects, and a man with golden hair was sitting in the middle. Upon noticing Liu's arrival, the man put down his work, pushed his glasses up, and remarked, Colonel Liu actually came here himself. Don't you usually solve problems with bullets? Facing the man's tease, Liu Feng reminded him expressionlessly, please cooperate, doctor. The blonde man was momentarily startled and then turned to Little Mushroom saying, follow me. Little Mushroom hurriedly followed and obediently lay down on the apparatus under the doctor's guidance. As the syringe began extracting blood, Little Mushroom turned his head nervously. The man glanced at the color of the blood. Shao Mogu mistook the man's words as a compliment and hastily replied with a polite, thank you for the praise. Colonel Liu brought his delicate wife for a checkup. However, Shao Mogu seemed quite afraid of Colonel Liu. Hearing Shao Mogu say thank you to him, the doctor visibly paused, then couldn't help but laugh out loud. Alright, send the blood for genetic testing. Time, 1 hour. A full body enhancement scan will take about 40 minutes. Don't move. The humming in the air was like those distant nights in the abyss, or like the sea emitting a dull sound of waves crashing. This feeling was indescribable in human language. Shao Mogu knew this might be the last 40 minutes of their life. Once it was over and they were discovered, they would be mercilessly shot by the judge. Not knowing how much time had passed until the doctor said it was okay, the mechanical ring automatically loosened. Shao Mogu was helped up by the doctor, who told them to rest on the chair while he checked the blood test results. After saying that, he didn't forget to pat Shao Mogu on the head. Shao Mogu, with messy hair, sat in the chair waiting for the blood test results. At a glance, he saw Colonel Liu, who was also sitting in his chair, waiting for the result. The jade-like eyes that normally shone with warmth turned ice-cold when they met the colonel's gaze. The little mushroom shuddered under his gaze and quietly turned away, attempting to escape the colonel's scrutiny in this manner. Finally, the doctor broke the awkward silence. After glancing at the genetic report in his hand, he announced that there were no abnormalities and that they could leave. However, Colonel Liu, still somewhat unconvinced, asked again whether it was absolutely certain that the individual was human. In response to the skepticism, the doctor merely smiled, although it might disappoint you, we indeed did not find any targets. See, even the little friend doesn't want to pay attention to you. The little mushroom was almost scared stiff. This cold-faced husband has killed without warning again. Facing the doctor's teasing, Colonel Liu coldly ordered the little mushroom to turn back around. Liu ordered little mushroom to turn around. Although he was extremely reluctant, he could only slowly turn halfway. What are you afraid of? Facing the colonel's question, little mushroom didn't know how to respond and could only hold the package and fall silent again. Seeing this, Liu lost the patience to continue the conversation. He stood up, put on his hat, then looked back at little mushroom, who was still sitting in the chair. Aren't you coming? Little mushroom quickly stood up and followed behind the colonel as they headed towards the exit. Suddenly, the colonel, who was walking in front, stopped. After a few seconds of silence, he said, the first time I saw you, I instinctively felt you weren't human. Little mushroom shivered at his words. But still, he suppressed his inner panic and asked, then, what about the second time? Liu didn't know how to answer this question. He took out the test report, confirmed it again, and then warned little mushroom, this is my first time applying for a genetic test. You better be. Little mushroom took the report from his hand. After a glance, both fell silent for a few seconds. Then Colonel Liu led little mushroom towards the exit again. As they approached the exit, they encountered a team pressing a man, not knowing where they were going. The officer leading the team greeted Lu respectfully upon seeing him, then stood up and explained that the man being escorted was highly suspected of being infected, but there was no conclusive evidence, so the family strongly requested a genetic test. After a glance, Lu casually responded, and the two teams parted ways. Right after, Little Mushroom heard a gunshot. This judge, without any warning, shot the man in the team. Colonel Lu was indeed exceptionally indulgent towards Little Mushroom. Surprisingly, he started to explain on his behalf. The colonel looked at the man lying in a pool of blood and said coldly, it was unnecessary. A woman in the crowd, stimulated by the scene, started screaming madly. Little Mushroom looked at Colonel Lu beside him. He had never seen such a look in his eyes before. It was a kind of coldness that seeped into the bones. Perhaps for a judge, killing was more normal than breathing. He would not have any emotional fluctuations because he had long been accustomed to it. Little Mushroom followed the colonel to the exit, where a body covered with a white cloth lay. It was Vance's body. Little Mushroom crouched down, wanting to lift the white cloth to take another look at Vance, but was stopped by a soldier next to him. The soldier told him that no one from the mercenary squad had survived, so the equipment and supplies would be reclaimed by the base. The spoils converted into currency would be merged with the consolation money and distributed to the families. Saying this, he pulled out an ID card and handed it to Little Mushroom. Little Mushroom fell silent, and after a moment, he asked the soldier where they were taking Vance. The soldier glanced at the body and simply replied, the incinerator. Hearing this reply, Little Mushroom fell silent again. Lu Feng, seeing this, felt obliged to remind him that he hadn't taken the ID card. Upon hearing this, Little Mushroom mustered the courage to look at Lu. He really wasn't injured? Lu Feng's eyes, like jade, hardened. He reached for the pistol at his waist, then walked towards Vance's body and lightly lifted a corner of the white cloth with the gun's muzzle. Little Mushroom followed this perspective, and the next instant, he was stunned. On the tip of Vance's finger, there was a barely noticeable stab wound. Little Mushroom felt a uniquely human emotion for the first time. It was a magical feeling. His heart became heavy at that moment when he saw the wound on Vance's fingertip. Little Mushroom instantly understood that it was not Anthony who was injured by the ant's mandibles that day, but Vance. He told himself that some people, even when injured, still have hope. They hide it because they want to go home. This person was actually talking about himself. Understanding everything, Little Mushroom silently took the ID card from the soldier and carefully put it into his own package. But when he lifted his head, he saw that the judge had already walked far away. A scream from behind caught Little Mushroom's attention. It was the family of the man who had just been shot. The woman ignored the soldier's obstruction and cursed at Lu Feng, who had already walked far away. Judge, you will die a terrible death. Little Mushroom walked to the woman's side. By this time, her tears had long dried up. She was just huddled in the corner, eyes vacant. Aren't you leaving? The woman glanced at him upon hearing this. What is your relationship with the dead one? Little Mushroom was stunned. He didn't know how to describe his relationship with Vance. After all, it was only a few days from when they first met to now being separated by life and death. After a moment, he spoke, he was my friend. He saved me. The answer suddenly reminded the woman of her past, and she started sobbing again. Little Mushroom watched the scene, wanting even more to clench the ID card belonging to Fancy in his hand. At this moment, he suddenly felt his heart heavy. He knew this was what humans felt. Newly arrived, Little Mushroom joined the organization resisting the terrestrial school. Did you have a quarrel with your husband? Little Mushroom followed the crowd toward the city. After the system recognized him, the true appearance of the northern base finally emerged before his eyes. He looked at the city, lost in thought. After a while, Little Mushroom came to his senses. He knew he had to go. He was here with a purpose. Little Mushroom followed the crowd onto a train. The carriage was already quite full, and everyone was talking about their adventures outside. Listening to the excited conversation of two men in the seat in front, Little Mushroom guessed that they must be happy. Happy people often don't mind helping others. So, he bravely stood up. How do I get to Zone 6? His guess was right. The man generously gave him directions. After expressing his thanks, Little Mushroom continued to sit and gaze out of the window, silently repeating the address of Anne's in his heart, Outer District 6, Building number 117, Apartment number 0514. But he had forgotten that he only asked for directions to District 6, so he got lost again after getting off. Little Mushroom looked at the vast bus station, wondering if he should ask someone for directions again. At that moment, a man with glasses approached him. Hello, friend, would you like to learn about us? Little Mushroom stared at the leaflet the man handed over, opposing the dictatorship of the judges, and was stunned. Do you know how to get to building number 11? Finally, Little Mushroom got a name of his own. Let's call him Anja. Let's call him Ans. Little Mushroom joined the bespectacled man's counter-trial march in confusion and also learned the direction of building number 117 from the man. As they got closer to the building, those memories about ants began to resurface in his mind. Guided by these memories, Little Mushroom came alone to a door and then tore off Anne's D-card from his body. With a beep, the door opened easily, and Little Mushroom saw Anne's home. The room was small but warm and tidy. He walked to the table. Looking at the small mirror on the table, Little Mushroom gently picked it up. From the mirror, Little Mushroom saw Anne's again. This was Anne's face, because the look in his eyes was different from the eyes in the mirror now. When Little Mushroom was very young, his stem was broken by slanting raindrops. Little Mushroom, like any injured creature, began to try hard to grow back, to live. Later on, Little Mushroom began to have some vague consciousness. He became different from his kind, able to control his mycelium, to flow between jungles and wilderness, and to sense the sounds and movements outside. He became a free mushroom. Then he met Anne's. Anne's once asked him if it hurt. Little Mushroom replied that he had already forgotten. And Zay said he wanted to give him a name. He said, "Little Mushroom, then I'll call you Anja." Thinking of Anja, the Anja in the mirror, couldn't help but smile. Little Mushroom first learned that he was actually a poisonous mushroom and finally felt the pressure of being human. Little Mushroom sat alone by the window, thinking about what to do next, looking at the sunlight outside. Little Mushroom couldn't help but extend his palm, then saw several white mycelium spreading out along his palm. Little Mushroom pulled off a bit of mycelium and put it in his mouth, chewed it. It was a soft, sweet taste. But the next moment, Little Mushroom felt the world in front of him becoming unreal. He felt his body sink into the deep sea, but his consciousness flew to the sky with the warm sunlight. It wasn't until evening that Little Mushroom slowly opened his eyes. He was awakened by the cold. Anju instinctively climbed onto the small bed next to him. Then he wrapped himself in the quilt and carefully thought about what had happened to him. He remembered that he had eaten his own mycelium and then fell into a coma. So he was a poisonous mushroom. Anju's stomach growled. He needed to replenish his energy. But there was no moist soil in the base, so he decided to replenish his energy by eating like humans. Anju went to the cafeteria and ordered mashed potatoes and potato soup. Then his balance was only 9.2. After paying the water bill, his card's balance was only 9.1. Anju finally realized that he needed to find a source of income. At this moment, someone behind him suddenly called out to him. Anju turned around towards the voice. He saw a man standing behind him. The man looked terrified upon seeing Anju for the first time. "Anja? You're back? Weren't you?" The man was actually Anju's childhood friend. But why didn't the little mushroom like him? Anju looked at the man in front of him. He remembered. The man's name was Chaoshi. He was Anju's neighbor and friend. They grew up together. In Little Mushroom's memory, Anju was a person who made a living through writing. His job was to write novels, essays, or poems for people to enjoy, and then submit them to the base. However, 3 months ago, in order to save the tight manpower and resources, the base disbanded this department. Since then, Anju prepared to participate in the selection exam for the base's supply station. But Chaoshi, upon hearing this news, was very unhappy, because he had always wanted to go on an expedition with Anju. Anju knew very well that his physical condition was not suitable for the outdoors. But he couldn't withstand Chaoshi's persistent persuasion and finally agreed. However, anything can happen in the wilderness. When facing death, the first reaction of any creature is to flee. Chaoshi did the same. He didn't do anything wrong, but Little Mushroom just didn't like him. Chaoshi looked at Anju, who appeared unharmed, with disbelief. "Your wounds have healed?" Faced with Chaoshi's question, Anju just silently looked at him. But in the next moment, Chaoshi still noticed something different. He suddenly stepped back and, trembling, pointed at Anju. "No, you are not Anju." Anju didn't want to deal with him and silently walked past him. "Sorry, I accidentally ate a poisonous mushroom, I don't remember who you are." After saying that, he took out his ID card, ready to leave. But the next moment, Josie grabbed Anja's shoulder. "You really are Anz. But you." Anja fell silent again, and after a moment, handed the test report in his arms to the other. It was only then that Josie accepted the fact that Anz had escaped from the abyss. Anja was a compliant little mushroom. He wouldn't violate any species laws, so he just needed to learn the base's routines. Facing Josie's doubts, Anja only said that he was saved by someone and forgot everything else. Josie was still a bit reluctant. He wanted to ask how much Anz had forgotten. Anja didn't want to get entangled, so he insisted that he had forgotten everything and didn't want the other to disturb his life anymore. Josie was stunned. In his impression, Ans was a very gentle person and wouldn't treat him this way. Anja didn't know how to respond. The two fell silent. After a while, Josie finally gave up and said he would come back to see him tomorrow, then prepared to leave. Ans, we are the closest people in the world. After Josie left, Anja curled up on the small bed alone, and a sudden wave of sadness washed over him. Only he himself knows that Ans has already become a skeleton, so Josie can no longer be the closest person to Ans. And he himself will return to the abyss after finding the spore, back to that quiet cave. Then, he will take root beside Ans and spend the rest of his life there. Thinking of the spore, the little mushroom suddenly remembers the bullet casing. He searches all over his body for it. Fortunately, the bullet casing was not lost, but just to be safe, Anja tied it with a small string. He wore it around his neck. Looking at the table neatly arranged with many books, Anja picked out a base manual. This booklet talks about the laws and regulations of the base at the beginning, but the little mushroom feels that he is a mushroom who abides by the rules and will not touch these. So he didn't want to look at this, and directly skipped to reading the lifestyle guide. From the handbook, he learned that the life of the base residents was very simple. Just lie in the room, eat, and drink within the rules. But if he ate, the cafeteria would deduct his money. What could he do about that? Under the pressure of survival, the little mushroom eventually chose to work to support himself. But having never understood human nature, could he really manage so smoothly? Anja understood that even though he was free in the base, he still needed to find a job for the sake of survival. Zhang was not protected by the laws of the base, but later, the little mushroom learned about protection and its consequences. The little mushroom learned about protection and its consequences. There was a free market across from supply station number 3. Maybe he could find a job there and plan to check it out the next day. After that, the little mushroom dug out a book called /Supply Station Assessment Manual / At the moment his finger touched this book, the memories belonging to Ans in his mind became incredibly clear. In every corner of the room, there were scenes of him studying with this book. It seemed that going to the supply station was something very important for Ans. There would be an assessment a year later at the supply station, and if he was still alive by then, he would give it a try. That way, when he returns to the cave, he can tell Ans what it was like there. Early the next morning, the little mushroom took a train to the free market. The noisy environment overwhelmed the little mushroom, who had just arrived. As he was confused, a couple approached with glasses in hand. "What are you looking at, kid?" "Here to learn how to drink." The woman quickly reminded, according to the base rules, minors are not allowed to drink. The man, however, was somewhat disdainful, so what if he drinks? Is the judge going to take him away? Their teasing made little mushroom unhappy. He wanted to tell them that he was not a minor. However, the sight of the couple embracing and kissing still made little mushroom blush and flee the scene. Just entering the black market, little mushroom faced a dilemma. The lady he encountered did not seem friendly. As little mushroom went deeper into the black market, he noticed fewer stalls outside. While he was lost in thought, a man approached with a smartphone. "Hey. A newly unearthed smartphone, it has battery and can be turned on, want to check it out? I'll give you a 10% discount." Anja wanted to refuse, but the man persisted. "You have a phone, right? Then do you need a power bank?" "I don't have money," Anja said, and immediately, the man's hands stopped moving. After a while, he sighed, "Why come to the black market with no money?" Anja expressed that he came to look for a job and asked the man if he knew where he could find one. The man looked at Anja and pondered for a moment. Then he pointed towards a passage. "You seem quite capable, go down there, to the 3rd level underground, my boss's wife is there." After expressing his gratitude, Anja followed the direction indicated by the man and arrived at the 3rd basement level. As soon as he arrived, a strange fragrance made Anja pinch his nose. He walked along the dark passageway for an unknown amount of time when a whispering sound made him stop in his tracks. After listening to the conversation in the shadows, Anja was stunned. He remembered what Hosen had said when he bullied him and finally realized what the 3rd basement level meant. Anja thought he should leave, but when he turned around, he bumped into a stranger's embrace. When the little mushroom looked up and saw the face of the person in front of him, he was even more shocked. It was a woman standing before him. Her already enchanting eyes were accentuated by the red dress she wore, adding to her allure. However, the leather jacket and the casually held cigarette in her hand added a hint of nonchalance to her charm. The little mushroom felt as if he had entered some kind of organization. Now he truly felt he was not in control of his own fate. The woman, with a highly provocative gaze, looked at the little mushroom below her and asked if he was here to buy someone or sell himself. Startled by his words, little mushroom took a few steps back, hastily claiming he just took the wrong path, which the woman obviously didn't believe. Knowing the 2nd floor of the black market was a gambling den, she refused to believe that this boy's intended destination was there. Little Mushroom didn't know how to respond and just nervously stared at the woman. Seeing his unease, the woman spoke to reassure him not to be afraid, promising she wouldn't harm him. "Can I go then?" His request seemed somewhat absurd to her. Only those who are desperate come to the third level, and she doubted he had a better place to go. She attributed his plea to him being frightened by the surroundings, telling him he didn't need to stay and offering to send him to a big room. "Thank you, but I really took the wrong way," he insisted. "I just want an ordinary job, then someone told me to come to the third level." The woman was surprised. "Only the first floor of the black market is public-facing, didn't you know that?" Embarrassed, Little Mushroom lowered his head. "I know that now." Yet the woman still didn't plan to let Little Mushroom go. The base laws don't protect the black market. No one can leave once they come to the third level. But consider yourself lucky, Mr. Zhao's workshop is short-staffed. If he wants you, you'll go with him. The woman didn't continue but motioned for Little Mushroom to follow her. Before long, they arrived at a door where the woman knocked gently. "Mr. Shao, here to discuss business with you." After finishing this sentence, the door was opened, revealing a crack, through which an old man appeared. "Duze, what a rare visitor." Little Mushroom finally found a job. Unexpectedly, his first job was to be a doll. Upon seeing Boss Shao for the first time, Duze wasted no words. "I heard your apprentice died from drinking. I'm next. What do you think of this kid of mine?" Boss Shao scrutinized him for a while. "Oh, seems very obedient." Hearing this, Duze was all smiles. "Actually, he is very obedient. I felt Boss Shao would like him the moment I saw him." Then Boss Shao asked Little Mushroom to stretch out his hand. After a glance, he became even more curious about Little Mushroom's background. He didn't believe such a kid would willingly run to the third floor. Duze proudly indicated that he had tricked him. At this point, Boss Shao asked Little Mushroom to slowly make a fist. Although he didn't understand why he had to do this, there were only 5 fingers after all. This was much easier than controlling thousands of mycelium. Duze, who was watching Little Mushroom's movements, was pleasantly surprised. "Boss Shao, you found a treasure. His hand is even steadier than your last apprentice." Seeing this, Boss Shao stated that he would borrow him for a few days and keep him if he proved to be useful. Little Mushroom was stunned when he heard the word useful. He was pondering what useful meant. Duze noticed Little Mushroom's unease.
Quickly comforted, "Don't be afraid. Boss Shao is indeed not a good person, but his craftsmanship is expensive." Upon hearing this, Boss Shao immediately retorted, "I am the biggest good person in this base." After saying that, he let Little Mushroom go into the shop first to browse around as he still had things to discuss with Duce. Little Mushroom walked into the shop alone. The house was filled with many unknown props. However, what caught his attention more was the conversation between the two outside the door. He vaguely heard something related to the judge, but Little Mushroom couldn't understand how the judge was related to the black market. Can you imagine the aloof Colonel Lu being made into a doll? It turns out that Duce wanted Boss Shao to make a judge puppet for her. For this, she was willing to pay any price. Boss Shao just smiled at her words and didn't say much more. At this moment, in the room, Little Mushroom's steps halted. When he looked down, he saw a fake hand. He crouched down and poked it with his hand. At the moment he looked up, he was stunned again. In front of him was a lifelike dummy. Little Mushroom stared blankly at the dummy. At some point, Boss Shao had returned from outside. He said lightly, "Looks real, doesn't it? Let me turn on the light for you so you can see better." With a click, the mannequin, under the light, appeared even more exquisitely delicate. Boss Shao finally began to explain the origin of this mannequin. Hubbard, the leader of mercenary team R-137, was once one of the fiercest in the squad. The man before us was his deputy. They grew up together, shared a close bond for over 20 years, but during their last expedition, he died, leaving not a single piece of his body behind. 3 months after his death, Hubbard approached Boss Shao and spent nearly all his fortune to buy this mannequin of his friend. Boss Shao, taking on this task, naturally dared not make any mistakes. This mannequin, apart from not being alive, resembled everything else exactly. After all, Hubbard would have to spend the rest of his life with this mannequin. Boss Shao used to deal in such trades. Later, as it became easier to die outside, his craftsmanship became more valuable. After all, it leaves a keepsake for the living to remember for the rest of their lives. Having said that, he patted Little Mushroom on the shoulder. "Learn well from me, in 10 years, you'll be worth more than all the mercenaries." Unable to resist, Little Mushroom asked him, "Are you going to be a judge?" Boss Shao immediately responded, "Why not? The judge, the lord, is busy killing. He doesn't care about such trivial matters." Little Mushroom finally found a clue about the spores. On his 3rd day working in the shop, Boss Shao suddenly notified Hubbard to come and collect the mannequin. After hanging up the phone, he carefully took the mannequin from the cabinet and placed it on a chair. Little Mushroom couldn't help but glance sideways at the person sitting on the chair, who seemed to come alive at that moment. Soon, the door creaked open and a dejected man walked in from outside. This man was Hubbard, the captain of the AR-137 mercenary team. His dull eyes fixed on the doll on the chair and he was completely captivated. It was a while before Mr. Shao, standing beside him, coughed, snapping him out of that state. Regaining his composure, Hubbard slowly approached the doll and just as he was about to touch its face, he suddenly stopped and withdrew his hand. Then he turned to Mr. Shao beside him and said thanks. No need, I still need to thank Mr. Hubbard for providing sufficient data. Do you need help putting it in the box? The man declined his kind offer and then personally picked up the doll and placed it into the box. Mr. Shao kindly reminded him, maintain the doll every 2 months, just send it over when it's time, I'll apply whatever new skills I acquire. Hubbard seemed to guess something, Shao Scott never makes a losing deal. Hearing this, Mr. Shao gave an awkward smile. Captain Hubbard is all-knowing, I am not. A few days ago, I took a big job. That guy's data wasn't good. I wanted to ask for your help, he said, gesturing with a hand like a gun. Hubbard immediately understood. He paused, then turned to leave, but Little Mushroom suddenly stopped him. Then he took out the shell casing hanging around his neck. Sir, do you know where this is from? Hubbard looked at it carefully and said, the supply station and the black market don't have this model. It's military. Little Mushroom met Colonel Liu again. It seemed like Colonel Liu didn't like him very much. Today was Little Mushroom's 3rd day working, and Boss Shao praised him for planting his eyebrows well, letting him off early and even giving him a month's pay in advance. So now Little Mushroom had $60. He planned to go to the 1st floor of the black market to have some potato soup. When he arrived at the 1st floor, he noticed that today's atmosphere was noticeably different. There were far fewer people than on previous days, and everyone looked quite tense. Though puzzled, he still decided to go get some potato soup first. As he approached the stall, Little Mushroom tensed up. Then he turned around and was about to run away, but the next moment, come back, stopped him in his tracks. And Jay could only turn back in resignation. He finally remembered that today was the tribunal's routine patrol. Liu stared coldly at the Little Mushroom and said, stiff body movements, avoiding action, deducted 1 point. The assistant beside him obediently wrote down a few notes in his book. And Jay paused. He glanced at Liu, but when their eyes met, he quickly looked away. Liu continued, avoiding eye contact, deducted 1 point. And Jay realized that this scene was very similar to when Boss Shao trained his apprentices. But unlike Boss Shao's patient guidance, Liu Feng's teaching methods were somewhat intimidating. Liu glanced at the assistant. He asked him for the results, and the assistant respectfully replied, reporting to the colonel, based on the overall indicators, the one under examination is human. The specific reason for this conclusion is that they are afraid of you. Liu Feng slightly curved his lips. It was the first time and Jay had seen him smile, although the smile was barely noticeable. This was the first time the Little Mushroom had seen Colonel Liu angry. So, what had happened? Liu Feng took out his pistol and gently stroked it. What are you doing here? And Jay truthfully answered, I work here. 1st floor or 2nd floor? Anzu hesitated for a few seconds before replying, 3rd floor. The assistant next to them logged the conversation between the two. No anomalies in language interrogation. The subject is human. Upon hearing this, Liu Feng suddenly turned his head, staring at him coldly. After a moment, he closed his eyes. You may leave. Little Mushroom quickly said, thank you, and slipped away from his side, heading back to that bean soup shop. Today, he really wanted to drink this, even though the potato soup here costs 3 times as much as in the residential area. The price of potato soup here is 3 times that in the residential area, but the difference is obvious. This one has minced meat, milk, and the soup is much thicker. It would be better if there was no adjudicator around. After drinking, Anja got up, wanting to leave. Facing the adjudicator standing nearby, his inner thought was to pass by without causing any disturbance. But in the end, things didn't go as he wished. At the moment they crossed paths, Anja suddenly heard Liu Feng curse, useless. This startled him, as if something major was about to happen. He didn't dare delay further and hurried to the station to head home. As the train arrived, the dense crowd inside began to disembark. At this moment, the announcement came on, informing the waiting crowd that due to equipment failure, they all had to wait scattered outside the train. Upon hearing this announcement, the crowd started to become chaotic, with everyone beginning to flee in one direction. Anja watched this inexplicable scene, feeling uneasy yet decided to follow the crowd first. A different species infiltrated the base. Madame Du had special feelings for Colonel Liu. The chaotic crowd left Anja at a loss. At this moment, a figure behind him bumped into him, and Jay turned around and saw Madame Du from the third floor of the black market. He wanted to say something, but Madame Du seemed very anxious and pulled Jay along as she ran. Late at night, a row of armored vehicles was neatly parked at the edge of the square. They, along with fully armed soldiers, joined forces to block all the exits of the square, and Jay realized that they were now at the city defense office. He reached out and patted Madame Du on the back to help her catch her breath. What happened to them? Upon hearing this, Deuce unconsciously looked vigilantly into the distance at those increasingly frenzied residents. There are aberrants among us, there must be one in the vehicles. Checking each vehicle takes too long. If an aberrant loses control and isn't killed in time, those who have a heart for saving the nation, water is the blade's salvation. It's been a long time since something like this happened. This time even the adjudicator didn't recognize them? At this, Deuce's expression turned tense, and Jay explained that the adjudicator was on patrol today. He also realized that what Lu Feng had just said to the communicator as trash must have been related to this incident. Deuce grabbed Jay. Is he here? It seemed that to confirm the truth of what Jay said, the moment after Deuce asked this question, they saw a streak of light flash through the air and then with a bang, it landed on a man's shoulder not far away, and Jay stared intently at the source of the streak. Against the backdrop of the night and the firelight, two long figures slowly approached from the shadows. Deuce was parasitized, and Colonel Lu enforced the law coldly. As magnesium flares from the armored vehicle swept across, several humans parasitized by aliens instantly turned into charred corpses. When Deuce saw this scene, he couldn't help but hold onto Anja beside him tightly, because among those parasitized, there was one sitting right behind him. However, it hadn't attacked anyone, so he should be safe. With that, Deuce turned to look back at the city gate, a hint of reminiscence appearing in his eyes. 5 years ago, the colonel saved me once as well, right at the city gate, similar to now. Listening to her recollection, Anja seemed to understand Lu a bit more. In this base, some people loathe Lu to the core, while others see him as a belief. A few minutes later, Lu Feng walked with his assistant towards several charred bodies. He knelt on one knee and took the knife handed by his assistant. Then, without expression, he sliced open the abdomen of one of them. Due to their position, Anja and Deuce could easily see the situation on the scene. Anja thought it looked like insect larvae, perhaps something like a spider. Upon seeing this, Lu Feng frowned. He swiftly cut open the entire esophagus and throat. Alien larvae poured out continuously. Lu Feng immediately stood up, removed his gloves, and tossed them onto the body. Parasitic type, high potential for spread. Full team inspection. Deuce suddenly collapsed, and Anja quickly supported her. At this moment, Deuce's entire body trembled uncontrollably. She remembered what she had just said, that person was just sitting behind me. Lu Feng also noticed the anomaly here. His eyes rested on Deuce's cheek, and Anja followed his gaze. They saw a small blister appear on Deuce's forehead. The thing inside was wriggling slightly. Deuce reached for the parasitized area. Her eyes were fixed on Lu Feng, who was walking toward her, looking at the gun pointed at her. She finally closed her eyes in despair. Following the bang of a gunshot, Deuce's entire body fell forward. After a dull thud, the once magnificent Madame Du finally fell, on that day 5 years ago. The little mushroom really didn't like Lu. He was too terrifying. Right after Deuce's death, several soldiers came to deal with her body. Looking at the terrified expressions of the people around him, Jay felt that there was no fundamental difference between the human base and the abyss. Both were filled with fear. People would argue because of the suspicion in their hearts. Eventually, it would escalate into physical fights, and then everything would end with the sound of a gunshot. The entire square fell into dead silence once again, and Jay wanted to see where Lu had gone. In a split second, he noticed a man in front of him with a brass-colored bullet shell at his feet. Instinctively, he touched his chest. Fortunately, his own was still there. And Jay quickly walked toward the bullet shell. His sudden movement startled the man nearby. "Damn, why are you getting so close to me?" And Jay explained, "Sorry, I dropped something." The moment he picked up the shell, he froze. The bullet shell in his hand, in terms of weight, pattern, and size, was no different from the one around his neck. He held the bullet casing tightly in his palm, pondering over what had just occurred. Lu had apparently been standing right here, or not far from here, when he shot Dusai. Then he fired his gun. This casing must belong to Lu Feng, to the tribunal. And what about this one of mine? Is it also related to the tribunal? If it is from the tribunal, I can't just go and ask directly. That would be like admitting I'm a rookie. Before he could think further, the broadcast resumed, announcing the end of the buffer period and instructing everyone to line up orderly for infection screening. A child in the crowd was puzzled, not understanding why they had to wait 30 minutes to be screened. His father explained, "You can't tell right after being bitten by a bug. The tribunal says, after 30 minutes, you can determine if there's an infection." Infection can be determined within 30 minutes. How exactly do they figure it out? I heard they kill whoever they want. Before the child could finish speaking, the father quickly stopped him. Shut up, do you want to be executed right now? And Jay stood among the crowd, listening to the sound of gunshots. Bit by bit, he saw Lu leaning against a stone pillar. By the 73rd shot, only Njay remained at the scene. Lu Feng scrutinized Njay carefully. What's in your hand? Njay paused for a moment, then obediently extended his hand to reveal the bullet casing in his palm. Lu Feng said nothing, and the two of them fell into an unusual silence. After a while, Lu Feng finally said, let's go. Njay's life returned to how it was before, but ever since that mutant incident, the base's defense measures became stricter than before. Boss Shao was quite satisfied with his new apprentice. How's your eyebrow practice going? Look at the photos more. Ensure accuracy. Njay responded. At that moment, Boss Shao suddenly started laughing. Hubbard has connections everywhere in the black market. Getting a few photos of the judges is no big deal. Now, Nizai has sharp claws wielding the bull cart of my world. Haha, Lu Feng is really terrifying. Even though he's a doll, Little Mushroom is too scared to sleep. Boss Shao is very satisfied with Hubbard's efficiency. Although they didn't obtain specific data, the photos were good enough to piece things together. He looked at Lu Feng's photos again and again, finally couldn't help but sigh. This face could really drive women crazy. Do you like him? Njay paused upon hearing this. He didn't know why Boss Shao asked that, but at the moment, he only felt fear toward Lu Feng. I don't like him. Upon hearing this, Boss Shao's expression immediately darkened. So, you're in the opposition party? My last apprentice was. He took my salary and yet had the audacity to take half a day off each week to protest. Njay explained that he had no intention of joining the opposition, but Boss Shao didn't want to hear it anymore. I don't care whether you're with the opposition or the loyalists. Just don't take time off. Little Mushroom immediately promised he wouldn't take time off. With that assurance, Boss Shao finally smiled. As expected of my good apprentice. Seeing that Boss Shao was in a good mood, Njay suddenly asked if he could live here. This made Boss Shao freeze, not understanding what was going on. Njay didn't know how to explain. My neighbor, he always. Before Njay could find the right words, Boss Shao raised an eyebrow. He wants to sleep with you? Njay quickly denied it. No, it's not like that. He just keeps trying to get close to me. Boss Shao could only sigh, thinking his apprentice was too naive. How is that any different from wanting to sleep with you? Njay felt there was still a difference. They used to be good friends, neighbors who grew up together. He worked as a mercenary outside, while Njay submitted articles to the city's newspaper. The two would usually look out for each other. Later on, he wanted to take the supply station exam, but he wasn't allowed to. He was told it was too difficult. He was advised to go with him to the wilderness to do some easy work. Anja couldn't understand why he was doing this. Boss Shao chuckled. If you pass the supply station exam and break away from the commoners and make something of yourself, what will he do then? He's destined to be an ordinary mercenary all his life. Will you still live with him? Maybe once you're in, you'll cozy up to some high-ranking officer in the supply station. Then he'll have no hold on you. Little Mushroom knew what kind of person Anja was, so he replied, I won't. Even if you don't do that, he'll still think so. Who can say for sure? The human heart is just that hard to read. So, never get involved with someone with no prospects. After listening to Boss Shao's words of wisdom, Anja felt even more that he was a good person. Boss Shao was like an elder among the abyss-dwelling creatures, offering life guidance to the younger generation. And this time, Boss Shao did not disappoint Anja. He agreed to Anja's request. Now, keep an eye out on the 3rd floor. Find the leader of a big mercenary squad. Someone like Hubbard. I guarantee once he sees you, he'll walk away. Just have your man beat him up. AR-1104's female captain would definitely like you. Boss Shao continued muttering to himself, but suddenly Anja stood up, walked over to him, and said, the fingers of a judge are a bit longer than this. This immediately shut Boss Shao up. He cursed and went back to his work. From today on, Anja would live on the 3rd floor. But tonight, no matter what, he couldn't fall asleep. Only because Lu Feng's puppet, under his carving, was too exquisitely delicate. This made him somewhat gloomy. Anja got out of bed, turned the puppet around, and then pushed it to a corner out of sight before he could go back to sleep peacefully. Sure enough, without Lu Feng's puppet watching him, Anja quickly fell into a deep sleep. The next day, early in the morning, Boss Shao woke up Anja. Why did you move the colonel to the side again? Anja sleepily explained, I can't sleep well with him by my side. This infuriated Boss Shao, who walked over to Anja's bed and knocked hard on his head, saying, you sure have a lot of issues. Weren't you fine sleeping with the head just a few days ago? Anja didn't reply, but in his heart, Lu Feng was more fearsome than the head, so he wrapped himself in the blanket again. Colonel Lu's puppet was finally completed, but Little Mushroom began to feel scared. Better cover him with a hat. In the end, Anja crawled out of bed and began to slowly get dressed. Seeing this, Boss Shao sighed and said, "Forget it. I don't think you should go out and mingle with mercenaries. Just stay with me properly." Little Mushroom was puzzled, but Boss Shao shook his head and muttered, "With your look, no, those mercenary ruffians will bully you." Little Mushroom was even more confused. "Why are they bullying me?" Boss Shao couldn't take it anymore and leaned in to knock on the other's forehead, just for fun. At this, Little Mushroom could only cover his head, feeling aggrieved. He felt that Boss Shao was already bullying him. Time flew by quickly, and in the blink of an eye, Anja had been making dolls for 30 days. That is to say, before today, they needed to deliver the dolls. Anja carefully checked the hair he had grown himself, ensuring there was no problem at all. Now, only the doll's eyes remained to be made. Lu Feng's eyes were very beautiful. Under the light, they were a cold green, like transparent ice that whitens in winter, freezing the color of green leaves. But in the dim light of the evening, they were a deep, dark green, like a lake in the night. As Anja carefully recalled, when the color mixed by Boss Shao matched what he remembered, he spoke up to remind him that Boss Shao had already mixed it right. He reminded Boss Shao that it was already prepared, and this insight made Boss Shao highly appreciative. And Jay didn't speak, he just handed the mold to Boss Shao, watching him pour the gel into it. Next, they wait for it to cool. Once it's set, it will be embedded into the sclera, and finally installed. And Jay quietly watched Lu, who was sitting in the chair. After a while, he felt a bit nervous. The doll before him looked so much like Lu Feng himself. He didn't dare to look any longer, took the military cap from the side, and swiftly placed it on the doll's head. Boss Shao didn't notice the Little Mushroom's action, still praising his perfect craftsmanship. It would be even more perfect if he found Le Sen to deliver it later, since he's affordable. But no one answered after multiple calls. Helpless, Boss Shao called Hubbard instead. This time, the message said the person had already left the base. Boss Shao felt something was wrong, grabbed his tablet. "Something's not right, quickly get rid of the goods, there's nothing else tonight. You're coming with me to deliver it," he said while rapidly deleting photos from the tablet. The two quickly arrived at District 6. And Jay and Boss Shao were carrying the boxes upstairs. And Jay noticed that all the women they encountered along the way were tall and strong, most of them with short hair. This was very different from Dusser. Dusser was beautiful and soft, a kind of softness that was rare even on the 3rd underground level. She was very special. Boss Shao also seemed to have noticed the Little Mushroom's odd behavior. He sighed, and for once, a rare trace of sorrow appeared on his face. "There's no second Dusser." The two followed the delivery address and stopped in front of door number 12. Little Mushroom knocked on the door. "Hello, we're here to deliver." Inside, it was completely silent. Little Mushroom tried knocking a few more times. As expected, no one responded. Boss Shao finally lost his patience and pounded on the door with his fist. "Is anyone there?" Delivery from the 3rd underground level. At this moment, a middle-aged woman approached. After some inquiry, they learned that the resident of number 12 had already died. Boss Shao was stunned for a moment. His expression became increasingly anxious. "Dead? Then who's going to pay me the remaining balance?" Clearly, this wasn't something the woman cared about. She casually said, "The person was killed by the judge. Go ask him to pay." This sentence made Jay, who was beside, freeze for a moment. He seemed to have guessed something and hurriedly asked the woman for the name of the resident in Unit 12. The woman was silent for a few seconds before uttering the name, Dusai. The Little Mushroom was entangled, but Colonel Lu arrived just in time to save him. He left behind his contact information. The Little Mushroom accompanied Boss Shao for a delivery. Upon arrival, he learned that the employer was Dusai. Both of them fell silent. Boss Shao couldn't help but scratch his head and glanced at the box beside him. After a long pause, he said, "Do you know how much this order is worth?" Hearing this, the Little Mushroom instinctively shook his head. "It's worth more than the one for Hubbard." After playing with so many men, who'd have thought she'd fall for someone? But the Little Mushroom had somewhat guessed the reason for Dusai's feelings. She had once told him that the Inquisitor had saved her. Upon hearing this, Boss Shao could only sigh helplessly. He hadn't expected that even someone like Dusai, who had grown up relying on men to survive, could be so foolish when it came to feelings. To the point where she never understood a simple truth, even at the cost of her life. From his perspective, someone as emotionless as the Inquisitor would only save her because he needed to kill a Barons. After saying this, Boss Shao furrowed his brows again. His biggest worry now was that with Dusai gone, what were they going to do with this batch of goods? If they got caught, the tribunal would definitely come after him. And Jay suggested they could just take it back to the store. But Boss Shao immediately shook his head, "Absolutely not. We haven't been able to reach Jin Sen suddenly. I'm afraid something's happened." After that, as if remembering something, He suddenly turned to Anja. I recall you live in District 6 too. Since you're not staying there, and you're not afraid of being seen, how about this? Tonight you take the goods back to your place, and in a few days, if no one's checking, you can find someone to take over. Anja had a plan in mind, but Boss Shao didn't give him any more time to think. After glancing at his watch, he hurriedly said, I have to go now. I'm barely going to make the last bus. In the end, Anja was left standing there, stunned. His CPU processed for a moment, and he nodded in agreement with the plan. In his view, since he wasn't living at home anyway, as long as the doll was locked up for the time being, there shouldn't be any problems. And so, the following slightly comical scene unfolded. Anja dragged a suitcase larger than himself, stumbling through the corridor as he moved. He finally realized the issue. The solid doll was too heavy. Fortunately, District 6 was a circular area, and the distance between number 13 and number 117 wasn't too far. After dawdling for quite some time, he finally reached the entrance. But then, he faced another problem. How was he going to carry the suitcase up to the 5th floor? The seemingly insurmountable journey broke Anja's spirit. He just wanted to rest for a while before thinking about anything else. And as he was resting, a shadowy figure suddenly rushed towards him, grabbing him in an embrace before he could react. Anja, I saw you from the window. I came down immediately. Why are you only back now? Why didn't you tell me? I've been looking for you. You can't leave again. Faced with Chao Zai's rapid string of questions, Anja didn't want to respond. All he wanted was to break free from the other person as quickly as possible. But after realizing it, Josie didn't loosen his grip. Instead, he held on even tighter. He thought the other person was still mad at him. I was wrong. He apologized. I love you. Hearing this, Anja felt that Boss Shao was right. This guy just wanted to So he calmly replied, thanks, but I already have someone. Josie laughed at those words. You're really mad. When you're upset, you like to deliberately provoke me. Anja really didn't want to keep entangling with this person, so he struggled again. As the two wrestled, a streak of light flashed by. Josie was startled and immediately let go of Anja, looking nervously toward the source of the bullet. Anja glanced over as well. In the shadow of the building, he noticed a faint figure. Anja knew who it was. Only people from the military were allowed to legally carry guns inside the city, and among the various military institutions, there was only one type of person who could fire at will. It seemed that today he'd run into Judge Lu's city patrol again. Lu Feng quickly walked up to them. Who is this person to you? Anja replied with, neighbor, upon hearing Lu Feng's lake-like eyes slowly shifting to Chaoshi. Faced with the gaze of the judge, Chaoshi was stiff all over. Fortunately, the other party did nothing. After scanning a few times, he turned his gaze back to Anja. Add 4117, my communication number. Next time this happens, if you want to contact me, he will be arrested for indecency. Anja nodded and responded, thinking the other party would leave at this point. Unexpectedly, the next thing he saw was Lu Feng putting his hand on his suitcase. Anja's heart skipped a beat, but then he heard Lu Feng's slightly indifferent voice. Want me to take it up? Colonel Lu used a small trick that revealed all of the little mushroom's secrets. Faced with the colonel's kindness, Anja was so scared that his whole body tensed up. He hurriedly prepared to snatch the suitcase from the other's hand. I can do it myself. Lu did not let go. Can you? Do you live on the 1st floor? Anja immediately stated that although he lived on the 5th floor, he could still take it up. Hearing this, Lu Feng softly said, oh, and pressed his thumb against Anja's hand. Then with a gentle push, Anja's palm was easily brushed aside. After confirming the floor number again with Anja, Lu Feng took the suitcase and strode toward the apartment building. It was only then that Anja realized he had unknowingly disclosed his floor number once again. Helpless, he could only follow along. However, as he was hurrying into the building, he still glanced at Josie, who was standing aside, sweating profusely and not daring to move at all. Little Mushroom felt that Boss Shao was indeed a knowledgeable life mentor. He was right again. As long as there was a powerful person by his side, Josie wouldn't dare approach, even though the judge had nothing to do with him. The only sound left in the hallway was the echo of army boots, which somewhat surprised Anja. He had thought the other would ask what was inside the box, but the other said nothing. At that moment, there were only two sounds between them, the sound of the army boots hitting the ground and the sound of his own heartbeat. The door opened, and Anja was the first to enter the room. He switched on the desk lamp placed in the corner, then, mimicking human etiquette, said to Lu Feng at the door, please come in. Lu Feng took off his military cap as he carried the box into the small room. After placing the box inside, he leaned against the door. Little Mushroom could tell he didn't seem to have any intention of leaving, so he tentatively asked, are you going to continue patrolling? Lu, still with his arms crossed over his chest, answered indifferently, no need. He simply stared at Anja without any attempt to hide it, until Anja felt a bit uncomfortable and turned his head away. He had some guess as to Lu Feng's reason for staying. Was he still suspicious that he wasn't human, staying behind to look for a flaw? Thinking this, he tried to remain calm. So, what will you do later? Go back to the city defense office to rest. And Jay continued to ask, aren't you going back to the tribunal? Lu Feng explained briefly, saying it was too far. After a few rounds of questions and answers, and Jay had run out of topics to talk about, he finally couldn't hold it in any longer and, gathering his courage, turned his head to look at Lu. So, when are you going? Lu Feng suddenly fell silent, quietly gazing at Jay across from him, and Jay instinctively lowered his eyelashes. He somewhat regretted asking that question. Would the other party make trouble for him? Fortunately, it was just his imagination. After a moment of silence, Lu simply ordered him to pour a glass of water. And Jay immediately agreed, but as he reached the water dispenser, he remembered he hadn't asked Lu whether he preferred hot or cold water. After some hesitation, Jay eventually pressed the button for cold water. If there had been ice water available, he thought, he definitely would have served Lu Feng a glass of ice water. He really didn't want to go back and face Lu. Did the tribunal officer help him carry things just for a glass of water? Had he been patrolling all night and just gotten thirsty? If he told Boss Shao about this tomorrow, the boss would surely claim that the officer was trying to flirt with him. But then, Jay realized something was off. Jin Sen had gone missing and Boss Shao didn't dare bring the box back to the shop. And tribunal officers always went out in teams, yet today Lu was alone, and just happened to be below his apartment. Normally, any suspicious activity would have caught his attention, but today, Lu hadn't even asked what was inside the box. That was strange, and Jay even started to suspect that Lu was here to arrest him. Thinking of this, Jay immediately took out his phone to call Boss Shao, but for some reason, the communicator showed that the call couldn't be completed. At that moment, a "come in" sounded from inside the room, completely stunning Jay. With no way out, he had no choice but to brace himself and push the door open. Little Mushroom carefully approached with a cup in both hands. "Colonel, your water." Lu remained still, but his expression grew colder. Jay seemed to realize something, and when he turned his head, he saw that Lu Feng was already sitting at his desk, holding the banner Jay had used during the recent anti-judgment march. Little Mushroom had been detained, and the reason? Allegedly for molesting Colonel Lu? Jay was utterly despairing when he realized his secret had been discovered. He carefully placed the cup on the table. "Your water." Hearing this, Lu put down the anti-resistance banner he'd been holding. He picked up the cup and took a small sip. "Cold?" Little Mushroom, frightened, immediately apologized. Lu Feng didn't speak anymore. After a while, he asked Jay again, "What crime did you commit?" Jay lowered his head. "I didn't get hot water for the colonel." But Lu Feng immediately said cold water would do too. Upon hearing this, Jay continued, participating in an illegal protest. But Lu Feng responded again, "That's not enough." At this point, Jay's heart sank completely. If none of these count as crimes, then the only crime left would be that one. But what crime should making a doll of the judge be? Jay felt a little regret. He should have studied the base laws carefully back then, even if he was just a harmless mushroom. A doll used for improper purposes should be. Jay thought of several crimes, but eventually felt that indecency was the most fitting. The corners of Lu Feng's lips curled slightly, and a teasing look appeared in his eyes. "Have you read the laws of the base?" Jay shook his head honestly. "No." Lu Feng fell silent for a moment. After a while, he said to Jay, "Come here." Upon hearing this, though reluctant, Jay obediently took a step forward. Lu Feng then said, "Hold out your hands." Jay obediently extended both hands, but immediately, Lu Feng said something bizarre again, "Put it on me." Little Mushroom was confused. "Where?" Lu Han replied succinctly, "On me." "Where?" Lu Han replied succinctly, "On me." Jay, although somewhat puzzled, still obediently reached out and placed his hand on Lu Han's chest. The next moment, Lu Feng unexpectedly pulled out a pair of shiny silver handcuffs, and quickly clamped them on Jay's wrists. For indecency, Jay was immediately baffled, staring blankly at the other person, unresponsive. Then Lu Feng took out a communicator, "Arrest complete. Confiscated one prohibited item. Come for support." Jay was thus taken to a pitch-dark room surrounded only by cold walls, and an iron door. He realized this must be what humans call a prison. Lu Feng stood at the door, indifferently said, "Interrogation tomorrow. You have 10 hours to prepare your defense." Jay, holding the iron door, extremely aggrieved, "I have no defense." Lu, as if he didn't see, indifferently as usual, "I thought so. Rest well." After saying that, he turned around and left without looking back, leaving Jay alone clinging to the iron door, tears falling to the ground. At this moment, a faint voice came from the darkness. I told you, not one less. Why has Hubbard suddenly gone out into the wild? Otherwise, he wouldn't miss his prison food. You two have doomed me. After that voice, another voice followed. It was your order, her order. The final payment hasn't been made yet. Anja recognized the voices. They were Mr. Shao and Jin Senator looking towards the sound. He saw both of them across the way. At this moment, Jin Sen also noticed Anja. He crossed his arms and said helplessly, I was just selling phones, when I got caught by the tribunal. Compared to Jin Sen, Mr. Shao wasn't faring any better. It turns out, after parting with Anja, he hadn't even entered the station before being captured. Jin Sen suddenly asked Anja, how about you? How were you caught? Hearing this, Anja fell silent. He didn't want to answer that question and instead asked Mr. Shao, Master, do I really seem that easy to bully? Mr. Shao affirmed, you just realized? But why do you ask? Anja still didn't want to answer the previous question, so he changed the subject again. What crimes did you commit? Mr. Shao, somewhat helplessly, do I even need to say? Illegally obtaining tribunal information. This answer made Anja even more disheartened. Is that so? Mr. Shao noticed something was off and asked suspiciously, what about you? Aren't you involved? Anja was already feeling guilty, but he still stubbornly replied, yes, but Mr. Shao had already seen through everything. Your voice has even changed. Anja quickly put on what he thought was his coldest face. No. A new character, a poet, enters the scene in prison. Did he come to promote psychedelic mushrooms? Jay was imprisoned by Colonel Liu for indecency and met Jin Sen and Boss Shao in jail. In the cramped space, Jin Sen lay on the board bed and yawned. The beds in prison hall are quite soft. Hearing this, Jay also looked towards the only thing that could be considered a tool in the cell, which presumably was the bed Jin Sen referred to. Thinking this, he picked up the thin blanket from the bed and wrapped it around his body, then sat cross-legged on top of it. At this moment, footsteps came from the prison corridor. It was the soldiers from the city defense. Upon seeing Jay and the others, one of the soldiers was surprised. There are 3 more, who brought them in. Another soldier immediately explained, the tribunal, by Colonel Liu, impressive, the city defense is now the logistics team for the tribunal. The glaring light made Jay squint his eyes, but luckily the soldiers didn't stay after saying this and turned to check other areas. Jay sat blankly on the bedboard, and the bored Jin Sen suddenly asked Boss Shao, you have experience, it won't be for long, right? Illegal acquisition of judge information depends on the purpose, as long as it doesn't harm the judge. Hearing this, Jin Sen suddenly laughed, but you used it for profit, there must be a fine. Boss Shao, who treasured money as life, suddenly paled, then I'd rather be locked up for a few more years. Jin Sen sighed, a judge is a judge. Even taking a photo leads to detention, I should just stick to selling phones. Boss Shao did not respond. Jay. From the neighboring cell, a very young voice came, illegal acquisition of judge information, I've seen it. Boss Shao immediately asked, how many days were you detained? The man replied, at most 3 years, one was executed, he wanted to assassinate the adjudicator but he failed. Boss Shao was puzzled, why was he executed even though he failed? The man replied calmly, that's what the Adjudicator Act stipulates. Boss Shao became somewhat flustered, we have no intention to harm him, how long will we be detained? The man told him, that depends on the adjudicator's mood. Upon hearing this, Jay couldn't help but hold the thin blanket tighter. He thought the adjudicator seemed in a pretty good mood. At this time, Jin Sen suddenly looked curiously at the stranger. Brother, what did you do? Incitement and spreading panic. I wrote articles for the cultural department, the city defense caught me, later, the cultural department dissolved, but I was never released. Jin Sen continued to ask, how long have you been locked up? From behind the iron door came 4 words, life imprisonment. Jin Sen was stunned for a moment and after a while said, are you messing with me? The little mushroom was a bit confused. From what the man said, he seemed to have the same job as Jay. But in Jay's memory, it was a very safe job. So he hurriedly turned his head to ask, what did you write? The man told him, I wrote about the history of the base in a popular science format. My pen name is, The Poet. Have you read it? Jay honestly replied, no. Do you want to hear it? I think your voice is very nice. Faced with the compliment, Jay politely responded, your voice is also very nice. But Boss Shao suddenly interrupted their conversation, stop. You're convicted of incitement. Don't think about inciting our kid. In response, the poet chuckled, you can just listen. Don't worry about being caught. What he said made so much sense that Boss Shao couldn't even come up with a rebuttal, remaining silent. The poet paused for a moment, then continued, it took me a long time to organize all this. Since being locked up, I rarely talk about it. I'll start from the desert age. I'll start from the desert era, he said. Before the desert era was a period of great prosperity. with a total of 7 billion people on Earth, and cities were filled with people. On the outskirts of the cities were farms, ranches, and factories. These places supplied the cities with production materials. There were wars back then, but they were between nations. Animals and plants were no match for human weaponry. It was the year 2020, over 100 years ago. I, as a mercenary, visited the ruins of a national research institute and dug out a document. It was a geomagnetic research report starting from the year 2020. That year, they detected a rapid weakening of the Earth's magnetic field. At this point, the poet suddenly asked, "Do you know what a magnetic field is?" Jin Sen quickly waved his hand, indicating he was uneducated. Mr. Shao, upon hearing this, also stayed silent, not saying a word. "It seems the base doesn't teach this stuff," he remarked. Anyway, by 2030, the geomagnetic field had disappeared. Jin Sen humbly asked, "So what exactly is the geomagnetic field?" The poet thought for a moment before slowly beginning. The Earth is a huge magnet, the south and north poles are its positive and negative poles. The geomagnetic field is everything. After the geomagnetic field disappeared, compasses stopped working, the global biosphere was in chaos, all human industries halted, unable to generate or use electricity. But this was still the least severe consequence of the disappearance of the geomagnetic field. In space, from all directions come solar rays and solar wind. They would be deflected by the Earth's magnetic field elsewhere and not harm terrestrial life. After the magnetic field disappeared, the entire Earth was directly exposed to solar wind and cosmic rays, leading to a series of diseases and natural disasters. These disasters caused half of the Earth's population to perish. This was the desert era. However, the desert era ended quickly. In 2020, mankind discovered changes in the geomagnetic field and had already proposed countermeasures, divided into Plan A and Plan B. The plan was to build huge magnetic field generators at two special sites in Asia and North America. One is called the Eastern Magnetic Pole, which is now the northern base, and the other is called the Western Magnetic Pole, now known as the underground city base. These two magnetic field generators replace the Earth's south and north poles, resonating with the charged particles in the solar wind to create a new magnetic field that covers the globe. Plan B is to build large underground cities, shifting human habitation from the surface to underground to protect against radiation and solar wind. In 2040, Plan B was successful and the underground cities opened for settlement. In 2043, Plan A succeeded, a weak magnetic field covered the globe, the climate ceased to worsen, organisms no longer died from cosmic radiation, and human technology began to recover. The period from 2040 to 2043 was known as the Dawn Era, but humanity's hardest times had just begun. An earthquake occurred in the prison. Who will save Little Mushroom? In the last episode, the poet was telling Anja and others about the captivating history of humanity's development when Jinsen suddenly interrupted. "I know, the era of great disaster has come." The poet responded, cosmic radiation brought unknown genetic mutations, and terrifying things mutated from it, starting with superbacteria, fungi, and viruses. They proliferated in human cities, indiscriminately infecting everyone. The cities were all hives. Hearing this, Anja grew curious. How did humanity survive then? The poet bowed his head, his expression turning somber, and told Anja, surviving was a matter of fate. In the human gene, being immune to these bacteria meant survival. Eventually, everyone left was immune. In the end, only about 100 million of the 3 billion people who survived the desert era on Earth remained. However, this wasn't the hardest time for humanity. Anja was completely captivated by the story and hurriedly asked for what happened next. The poet said they all already knew the rest. Biological mutations appeared, and humans who came into contact with them got infected, gradually losing their human traits and becoming assimilated. For them, human genes were a delicacy, so they started attacking humans. Thus, the war began. It was the grandest war in human history. Scattered humans couldn't withstand the monsters, so humanity began consolidating remaining resources to establish human bases. Their ID number starts with 3, meaning this is the third human base. Correspondingly, there are also the Dungeon Base and the Virginia Base. The alliance of these 4 bases is the community of human destiny. After the bases were formed, humanity could finally catch a breath, leading to the life everyone has now. Hearing this, the group was about to relax, but the poet's next words instantly chilled the prison atmosphere. Unfortunately, the base is not a safe place. In 2073, a wave of mutated toothed creatures erupted. The southeast base has fallen. In 2121, marine mutants infiltrated. The Virginia base is overrun. Jin Sen suddenly interrupted in terror. "Damn it. Now I know why you were charged with incitement and malicious spreading of panic. The city defense should seal your mouth." The poet didn't care too much about it. He said he hadn't done anything wrong, just mixed with his male friend's mercenary group. gathering data around human ruins and organizing them for publication. Yet, for just that, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. His explanation did not win Jin-sen's sympathy, even making him somewhat puzzled. Your tongue should be cut off for life, you even have a boyfriend? The poet laughed. It's so boring in the base, why can't I have male friends? As soon as he finished speaking, the entire prison started shaking violently. Anja quickly grabbed the iron door, trying to stabilize himself. He heard it, something alive was hitting the floor underground. Jin-sen next door suddenly screamed in terror, damn, that thing is right beneath me. In an instant, the entire prison erupted into chaos. The poet also became panicked. It seemed that the entire prison was affected this time. Underground creatures, could it be the CC species? They live in groups, and the southeast base is. Before he could finish, he suddenly corrected himself. No, the CC species doesn't have that much strength. The poet tried to steady himself, reaching his hand towards the ground. He was trying to investigate the source of this unknown force when, at that moment, a series of rapid footsteps approached from afar. They were the city defense soldiers, trying their best to calm the prisoners inside the jail. They tried to appease the inmates in the prison, telling them that the base was reinforced with concrete and special steel plates, and they were investigating the cause. But just as they finished these reassuring words, a series of sharp, urgent alarm sounds erupted throughout the prison. This was the evacuation signal. Jin-sen banged on the iron door vigorously. Bro, open the door, the evacuation alarm is sounding. Hey. Bro. Poet, that guy is a felon, he's dangerous, open mine first. Xiaomogu threw himself into the arms of Colonel Liu, who rolled on the floor holding him. In the last episode, the entire prison experienced an inexplicable shake, and everyone hurriedly evacuated. Jin-sen couldn't care less, he quickly shouted for the soldiers to open his door first. The soldiers hesitated upon hearing this, but the next moment, they still came to Jin-sen's door. It was evident that the soldiers were also very nervous. Their trembling hands fumbled several times before the key was inserted into the lock. Jin-sen was just about to thank them when suddenly, his voice stopped abruptly. The floor creaked ominously, and before he could react, a huge black object pushed through the cracked floor and sprung upwards, accompanied by a dull sound of a body bursting. Jin-sen's entire body was pinned midair by the monster. Anja was frozen in fear. At that moment, shouts from other soldiers echoed from deeper in the corridor, quick! Get out! Before the sentence was finished, the entire prison floor started to crack. Anja heard chewing sounds. The prelude was the sound of water, followed by the sound of bones breaking. These sounds came from the end of the corridor. Anja didn't dare to delay any longer. He manipulated the hyphae to slowly approach the key on the ground and then drag it step by step towards the iron door. The heavily injured soldier who had fallen to the ground saw this scene and was completely terrified. His eyes were filled with horror, but Anja knew that even if the other person saw it, it wouldn't matter, because he was so seriously injured that he wouldn't live much longer. Anja asked the poet next door which door number he was. The poet's voice trembled. 17, are you okay? Anja replied, I'm fine. He estimated that the poet's vision was limited and shouldn't be able to see his hyphae. Retracting the hyphae, he grabbed the key. He quickly opened the iron door, and the chewing sounds from deep in the corridor began to speed up. Anja understood that he needed to move faster. He reached the door next door and shakily pulled out key number 18. Using the flashlight's remaining light, he inserted the key into the lock. At this moment, the chewing sounds from deep in the corridor completely stopped. Anja quickly pulled out the poet. Without waiting for him to react, he grabbed him and fled towards safety. The poet's eyes were full of fear, as if the monster behind them was beyond his imagination. The ground began to tremble again as the monster caught up. Anja turned his head to check, but immediately after, he heard the poet panting, don't look back. Yet Anja couldn't help but turn his head back, seeing two worms, each almost as wide as half the corridor. The poet clenched his teeth and pulled Anja to flee, but then the ground shook again. Anja was lifted off his feet by the force, and a sharp pain shot through his left arm, as if it had been cut by a twisted metal door. Using his other arm, he pushed himself up with help from the poet, and they sprinted once more towards the direction of the passage in their memory. In the darkness, anything could happen. Anja didn't know what awaited him ahead. Was it a third worm? Or perhaps they would crash into a wall because they couldn't see. Or maybe not, as Anja did indeed crash into a wall, his head striking something metallic. Then came another pain, he crashed into some unknown object. Anja's body went limp from the impact, uncontrollably slumping down. The next moment, something wrapped around his waist, trying to lift him back onto his feet. This wall even has hands? And Jay complained. Is there anyone else alive back there? Lu Feng's voice rang out from very close by, his speech much faster than usual, and Jay's heart nearly stopped. He stammered, no. Hearing this, Lu Feng quickly ordered the soldiers beside him to prepare the uranium bomb. As soon as he finished speaking, a dazzling white light flared from where they stood, rushing down the corridor. Before Anja could react, Lu Feng pushed him down hard. The two rolled on the ground. The next instant, a muffled explosion sounded from behind them, the blinding white light fading as quickly as it appeared. Lu Feng's figure cast a dazzling shadow on Anja's retina. He closed his eyes, his right hand clutching Lu Feng's sleeve tightly, gasping for breath. Don't get me wrong, it's just that Little Mushroom ran too fast just now. Lu Feng actually dared to laugh at Little Mushroom. This made Little Mushroom feel very wronged. After the explosion, Lu Feng helped Anja up the stairs. Having used up so much energy escaping, Anja was struggling to keep up. But miraculously, Lu Feng's hand seemed to have a special knack for it. Whenever Anja faltered, he would pull him along at just the right moment. Anja blindly followed Lu Feng, not knowing for how long. The cold air outside finally rushed back into his airways. He was almost completely leaning on Lu Feng, gasping heavily. With a calm expression, Lu Feng comforted Anja in his arms, telling him everything was all right. Suddenly, a figure approached and waved at Anja. It was Boss Shao. He took Anja's arm, taking him from Lu Feng's hands. Anja's condition had finally improved a bit, and his vision gradually cleared. He remembered the poet and was just about to ask about him. Then he heard a pleasant voice behind him. I'm here. Anja turned around and saw the poet leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, also catching his breath. Once he caught it, he slowly said, "You're quite the bumper." This jest made everyone present fall silent for a moment, except for the poet, who squinted his eyes with a smile. Before Anja could say anything, he saw Lu Feng suddenly turn around. "Director Howard, you're late." Anja followed the voice and saw a line of soldiers approaching, led by a tall man in the city defense uniform. The emblem on the man's shoulder was the same as that of Lu Han, also a colonel. This must be the director of the city defense. Howard's voice, as steady and firm as his appearance, told Lu Feng that he had been ready to bomb indiscriminately, but Colonel Lu had overstepped his authority by entering. This made it very difficult for him. Lu Feng responded in a similarly cold tone. Lu Han replied in a cold tone, "After all, my prisoner is still inside, the place with the ultrasonic disperser. You dare to bomb indiscriminately?" Howard's gaze darkened. "The city defense's equipment is none of the tribunal's concern. You better check if the people coming out from underground are infected." Lu Feng's moss-green eyes suddenly turned cold. "The tribunal's duties are none of your concern either." Howard's gaze then abruptly shifted to Anja at the side. Anja met his gaze briefly, realizing Howard was looking at his left arm, which had been injured in the underground tunnel. At that moment, Lu Feng suddenly reached out and grabbed Nja's shoulder. "During the buffer period, I will take him away for surveillance." Hearing this, Howard said no more and immediately turned to the city defense soldiers, "Prepare for the bombing." After that, Nja was taken away by Lu Feng under the watchful eyes of Boss Shao. In the city defense's office, Lu Han was in a room with no decorations. As soon as Nja entered, he locked the door, then walked over to the desk, opened a drawer, and tossed a white object to Nja. Nja caught it instinctively. It was a roll of bandages. He understood the other's intention. He was supposed to bandage his wounds himself. So, he sat down at another set of table and chairs, started fiddling with the bandage, thinking to himself that although the judge arbitrarily sentences people, he might also be a good person. Nja tore off about half a meter of bandage and began wrapping it around his left arm with his right hand, but couldn't manage to secure it. When he finally managed to wrap it, it was loose and he couldn't tie a knot. Nja felt that as a human on the surface, if he couldn't even wrap a bandage properly, it might be a bit embarrassing, so after furrowing his brow, he continued trying to tie the knot. Lu Han stared unblinkingly at the busy little mushroom. Anja also felt it and guessed that the other party must be looking for his flaws. Thinking of the thunderous methods the judge would use if he were discovered, Anja couldn't help but become nervous, causing his already poor knotting skills to worsen, and finally his hands trembled, and the bandage he had wrapped came undone. At the moment it came undone, Anja really got angry, even thinking about extending his mycelium to wrap the bandage for himself. Then, a soft chuckle came from the other side, not really a laugh but more of a breathy sound, short and almost inaudible. But Anja still heard it. It was a sneer, a mockery. The judge was mocking him. Suddenly, the little mushroom acted coquettishly. How could Colonel Lu resist? While Anja was somewhat depressed by Lu Han's mockery, a hand suddenly appeared in front of him. The fingers of this hand were long, the skin cold and pale. It picked up the bandage from Anja's wrist and wrapped it around a few times, slightly tight. Before Anja could react, he saw the other person's 10 fingers skillfully interweave, quickly tying a neat knot. Lu had finished wrapping the bandage for him. Although this person had mocked him a second ago, Anja still politely said thank you. Lu Han didn't reply upon hearing this. At that moment, a huge explosion suddenly came from downstairs, The sound was deep, as if coming from deep underground, and Anja couldn't help but look down. Rows of heavily armored soldiers orderly evacuated the survivors from the command building. After the complete evacuation, the blasting sound rang again. The entire building was groaning under the bombardment of uranium shells, some rooms even collapsed. The once grand and sturdy building gradually turned into ruins. At this moment, Anja saw Lu Han stand up and walk to the window. Surprisingly, he was not looking at the demolition but turned his head to the other side. Anja followed his gaze and saw a huge black device placed at this end, resembling a black circular disc. If one stood underneath and looked up, they might not even see the sky. Anja propped his chin and stared there, always feeling grandeur and alienation from human creations. From the corner of his eye, he saw Lu take out a communicator and dial a number. Then a familiar voice came through. Tribunal, Lu Han. Request to connect to the lighthouse center. His voice was still so cold, like a certain snowfall in deep winter. Since the two were close by, some sounds from the communicator naturally fell into Anja's ears. The young man on the other end didn't waste words and directly inquired about the situation at the defense facility. Lu explained, underground invasion, large worm-like creatures, suspected to be social, defensive facility is currently secure. Upon hearing this, the other party immediately stated that they would send a research team to the defense facility, but they must be cautious to protect the dispersal device. After saying that, he hung up the call. Just as this conversation ended, the communicator rang again. This time it was Howard who called proactively. He told Lu Feng that they couldn't bomb the underground of Building 3 anymore because their team had reached the crawling track and was fighting the creature hand to hand. The severely injured had been killed, and the slightly injured were being evacuated. He hoped Lu Feng could keep an eye on it. Lu Feng looked downstairs and responded softly, then reminded the other party, the worm-type creatures are highly dangerous, evacuate immediately upon contact with the mucus. Also, keep an eye on the dispersal device. Hearing this, Howard's tone turned cold, no traces found moving towards the dispersal. Colonel Lu, just focus on your own duties. Lu Feng didn't seem to care and ended the call after replying, copy that. Based on their conversation, Jay guessed that the giant black device in front of him was a dispersal unit. He had seen the term in the base handbook. There were 10 ultrasonic dispersal units in the outer city, all managed by the dispersal center located in base sector 1. The purpose of these devices was to protect the base from airborne monsters, such as arthropods and birds. Jay didn't quite understand how they worked, but he found them fascinating. Lu Feng leaned against the window, looking relaxed, but his eyes were fixed on the soldiers downstairs. Jay knew he was monitoring the soldiers' safety. With nothing else to do, he turned his gaze back to the room. The office wasn't large. Besides 2 sets of tables and chairs, it was mostly filled with documents and folders. There were also some empty glass jars. Further along, there was a bag of something that looked like soil samples, labeled with a white safety tag. Seeing these things, Jay froze. He thought of his own spores. Would they also be stored in these airtight jars? The spores were the most important part of him. Yet, all the clues currently pointed to Lu Feng. It seemed that if he wanted to find his spores, he had to ask Lu Feng. But he was just a mushroom. He knew he wasn't human. He was also aware of Lu Feng's sharp observation skills. It was highly likely that as soon as he spoke, it was highly possible that the moment I opened my mouth, he would become suspicious. Or, had he also been observing Lu Hangfeng for a while, just like he was being observed? This thought sent a shiver down Jay's spine, and he quickly looked up. His eyes met Lu Feng's. Under the dim light, the colonel's narrow, dark green eyes held an indifferent expression. Jay couldn't tell how long he had been watched. He felt he was under suspicion again, but he had to bluff his way through. So, he blinked at the colonel. Lu Feng's expression remained unchanged as he replied flatly, the buffer period is over. You can leave. Jay hesitated slightly. Do you mean back downstairs? Lu Feng gave a faint hum of affirmation. The returned criminals were all arranged in temporary tents in the atrium, guarded by soldiers. Jay also wanted to go back down. Compared to facing Lu Hangfeng, he preferred to face his master and the poet, but his craving for the spores overcame his fear of the colonel. After a moment, he bit his lower lip and mumbled, it's cold down there. The little mushroom acted coquettishly towards Colonel Lu, but was dismissed by him for being too delicate. Previously, Jay, in order to obtain clues about the spores, acted coquettishly towards Lu Feng, saying it was too cold downstairs. Lu Feng replied indifferently, you're a returned criminal. Jay immediately protested, but I didn't commit any WX crimes. Lu Hangfeng looked at him. After 2 seconds, he suddenly laughed. Fine. The crime of illegally stealing information from a judge. Double the sentence. Jay panicked immediately. He tried to argue that he hadn't stolen anything, just used his information to make something. After saying, "Oh," he added, "using judge's information for illegal profit," sentence doubled. And Jay lowered his voice, "I didn't make any profit." Lu Han, with his arms crossed and glaring at him, "If not for profit, did you use it for yourself?" Unable to refute, and Jay could only bow his head as if he hadn't heard. But Lu Feng was not willing to let go of this opportunity to tease. He raised his eyebrows and continued to ask, "How much profit did you make?" And Jay replied sadly that he didn't know. Lu Feng asked again, "What's your salary?" This time, the little mushroom proudly answered, 60. Upon hearing this, Lu Feng laughed again. "How pathetic, your boss is deceiving you. Remember to ask for a raise after you get out of jail." And Jay felt mocked again, the third time tonight by this person. He was convinced that Lu Feng must be the most bullying human in this base. Before he could think of a reply, he saw Lu Feng looking down at his wristwatch. Then, in a commanding tone that Jay was very familiar with, he said, "It's midnight, go down and sleep." Just then, the cold night wind blew through the window. It blew directly on Jay's face, making him sneeze softly. He saw Lu Feng frown across him and then coldly said, "So delicate." And Jay knew he was being disdained again, but the wind was really too cold, and he couldn't help but sneeze once more. Anja actually didn't want to do this. He really wanted to find some clues by staying near Lu, but he was also really afraid of the cold. Now, looking at the colonel's expression, he realized that if he didn't leave, he might be thrown out of the window. Seeing this, Anja lowered his head and tightened the collar of his clothes. He stood up, turned around, and walked away. Just as he reached the door, Lu called out to him. Hearing this, Anja turned his head and saw Lu still leaning against the window with his arms crossed. Lu glanced towards the right side of the room and said indifferently, "You can go there." Anja followed his gaze. He discovered a hidden door on that wall. He walked over and opened it. It was a restroom with a simple bed and a table inside. Anja realized that this was Lu Feng's room. He turned back to look at Lu Feng. He heard the other person speak in the same indifferent tone, "I can't sleep tonight. You can choose to sleep here or outside." After a brief consideration, Anja decisively replied, "Thank you." He walked into the room, closed the door, and carefully examined everything inside. The room was filled with a cold and desolate atmosphere. It was clear that Lu Feng rarely stayed here. Only the creases on the bed sheets indicated that someone had indeed slept here. In the center of the table, a booklet was spread open with black notes on it. 6.16, Normal. And Jay immediately realized that this was the work log of the adjudicator. He flipped forward to May. This time, the record was slightly different. Among a series of normal entries, there was a record of an alien invasion. Moving up, there was the anomaly on May 15, suspect D3,261,170,514. Danger level extremely low, genetic check passed, entry to the city permitted. And Jay's feelings became complicated. So, on that day at the city gate, Lu Feng not only discovered his anomaly, he also thought he was very weak. But he didn't stop there. A hunch drove him to continue flipping forward. He remembered Boss Shao once said that everyone in the military, even those in the tribunal, would go on field missions. And the place where he lost the spores had the shell casings of the tribunal. And Jay's heart was pounding until he found the record of February 20th. 2.20, returning to the city. Sample handed over to the lighthouse. And Jay's gaze froze. He continued to flip forward. The records on this page suddenly became dense. 2.12, Abyss outside, added 4 map records, collected 7 plant samples, 4 animal samples, and 7 secretion samples. And Jay instantly realized that Lu Feng had been to the Abyss. His sunlight paused on the last entry on this page. 2.14, outside, collected an abnormal fungal sample on the way back. Spore. And Jay's mind went blank for a moment, and his hand holding the booklet trembled uncontrollably. Lu Han finally had some close contact with the little mushroom. What was in Jay, lying on the colonel's back, thinking at this moment? In the last episode, Jay finally found the exact clue to his spores. February 14th, according to the human seasons, was still winter. On the night he lost the spores in his memory and dreams, there was the sound of cold wind. There wouldn't be another mushroom in the world losing spores during the same winter. So, his encounter with Lu Feng was much earlier than that meeting at the city gate. Or perhaps, the adjudicator just across the wall personally took the spores from his body. Pausing briefly, Jay flipped another page of the worklog. 2.20, returning to the city. Sample handed over to the lighthouse. His gaze lingered on this line for a few seconds. He then returned the journal to its original position, as if it had never been touched. Having understood everything, Jay finally raised his head and looked towards the wall behind the desk. On the grayish-white wall, 8 large characters were painted in red, humanity's interests above all else. And Jay suddenly felt a chill, and he shivered involuntarily. He shivered involuntarily and glanced at the bed beside him. After hesitating for a few seconds, he obediently climbed onto it. His head sank into the pillow. He didn't dare to wrap himself completely in the blanket like he usually did, but just draped it lightly over himself and curled up as much as possible. From the office next door, he could still hear Lu Feng's brief conversation with someone he didn't recognize. An indescribable feeling welled up in Jay's heart. It was a strange feeling, seemingly dangerous yet safe. And Jay felt that anyone would have insomnia in this situation, let alone him, who was just a mushroom. But surprisingly, he didn't suffer from insomnia for long this time. Under the influence of the blanket, Jay felt the world before his eyes gradually blur. Unconsciously, he dreamt again of the scene where his spores were taken. But the next moment, a hand reached out and patted the pillow beside him, and Jay opened his eyes groggily, and a pair of cold green eyes met his. It was Lu Feng, the culprit who had taken his spores. Seeing that he had woken up, Lu Feng didn't hesitate. He pulled back the blanket and quickly explained, "Evacuate." He didn't really need to say it, and Jay had already sensed something was wrong the moment he woke up. He felt the building beneath him tremble slightly, just like in the dungeon. Could it be that worms had appeared under this building too? He didn't have time to think, quickly getting out of bed and putting on his shoes. Lu Feng grabbed his shoulder with his right hand and led him out. The moment he opened the door, a gust of cold wind rushed in, suddenly coming from the warmth of the quilt to this situation. Anja instinctively shivered, and Lu Feng noticed it too. He paused slightly, holding Anja's hand. Then, he took a coat from the nearby rack and threw it over Anja without a word. Anja didn't even have time to say thank you before he saw Lu Feng quickly grabbing a ballpoint pen and manual from the table. Then, he stuffed them into his coat pocket. Following a firm grip on his wrist, he was led out of the room by Lu Feng. Outside the door, two judges who had been waiting for a long time saw Lu Feng and quickly called out, "Colonel." Lu Feng did not respond and turned to leave, expressionless, dragging Anja with him. But Anja became a bit nervous because he noticed that the two judges glanced at him. The group descended the stairs through the nearest emergency exit, which was pitch dark inside except for the self-luminous green glow indicators. The staircase was narrow and steep. Anja gradually struggled to keep up with their pace. He realized that unless he turned into mycelium, he wouldn't just lag behind but would also slow down Lu Feng. Just as he was about to ask Lu Feng to let go, suddenly a force came from his shoulder. Lu Feng, holding his shoulder, twisted him to the side and back, the inertia of descending the stairs still in effect. And Jay suddenly crashed into Lu Feng's back, and because of the slant of the stairs, he was positioned higher than Lu Han. Instinctively, he grabbed onto Lu and then found himself being carried on this person's back, holding onto the neck of the adjudicator, reflecting on the chaotic yet seemingly logical series of actions, and Jay felt amazed. More crucially, carrying him seemed effortless for the other person, who easily leapt down several steps and landed steadily, then took a running start and jumped directly out of the second-floor window. The next moment, the only thing Jay could hear was the whooshing wind by his ears, and when he opened his eyes again, he saw that Lu Feng had already landed on the lawn below. Even through several layers of clothing, Jay could feel the other's tense moment of gathering strength, the terrifying explosive power. Yet he himself, clearly also possessing a human body, was already exerting a lot of effort just holding onto Lu Feng tightly, feeling a gap wider than that between humans and mushrooms, which Jay felt for the first time. But the next moment, he realized something was wrong. It seemed like everyone in the courtyard was looking at him. Colonel Lu and Howard were starting another dispute. Is the base about to be invaded by monsters? As mentioned in the last episode, the building was invaded by worms. Lu Feng carried Jay and leapt down from the building, but this scene was also witnessed by everyone in the courtyard. Upon hearing the noise, Boss Shao poked his head out of the tent and was taken aback by the scene in front of him. He couldn't help but make faces at Jay, who then let go of Lu Feng's neck with a soft, "Thank you." "You're welcome, go to the tent," Lu Feng replied, his voice still devoid of any warmth. Jay acknowledged and turned around only to see Howard approaching. "What happened?" Lu Feng asked, turning his head. Howard informed him that the situation had changed. After activating the radar, the lighthouse spotted bugs under all 4 buildings. Underneath the city defense was a nest of bugs trying to break through the ground to attack the people inside the buildings. Thus, a full evacuation was now necessary. Including him, Lu Feng heard but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked Howard to show him the radar imaging, but Howard indicated there was no need to look anymore, it was already hopeless. "But the disperser is here." Faced with Lu Feng's successive challenges, Howard's voice grew colder. "The disperser can't be saved," he said. "How many times do I have to tell you? After the evacuation, I will immediately contact the dispersal center, and increase the working intensity of the other 9 dispersers." Lu Feng's expression was icy, and he clasped the gun at his waist, repeating word by word, "Show me the radar imaging." Howard seemed about to lose his temper but was wary of the judge's privilege to kill at any time and place. He eventually compromised, and a man in a simple shirt walked out from behind him with a device in hand. Lu Feng took it from his hands, sunlight sweeping over the screen. Then, his expression changed, becoming colder than the ice of deep winter. Everything around seemed to chill at his next words. "Monsters, the target isn't the people inside the buildings. There's a disperser in the courtyard. The foundation has been reinforced and can't be broken. They can only come out from under the 4 buildings." Lu Feng's analysis was logical, but Howard didn't agree. "The lighthouse's report doesn't support your conclusion." Colonel Lu Feng narrowed his eyes, his icy glare freezing everyone present. "I spent half the year in the abyss, Howard. I've seen more monsters than you've seen people." Howard fell silent. After a few seconds, as if remembering something, his face suddenly changed. "Wait, what about the other dispersal units?" Lu Han ordered the sergeant behind him to contact the dispersal center immediately. The adjudicator dialed the number and pressed the speakerphone button. A monotonous dial tone rang out. The atrium fell silent. After a few seconds, a rapid busy signal came from the communicator. Then the busy signal stopped, and the communicator automatically disconnected. Howard panicked. He immediately took out his own communicator and ordered City Defense. He directed towards there. "Howard, switch to the dispersion center. Any line will do, immediately." The operator responded with a, "Please wait," and then fell silent. After several minutes, the communicator rang again, the operator's voice trembling. "The dispersion center is out of contact." As soon as the words were spoken, Lu Feng's expression changed. He turned and walked towards the door. The lighthouse researcher quickly followed. At the entrance of the city defense office, a young judge ran over. Lu Feng instructed them to stay and assist the city defense office. "Colonel, do we need to convene the tribunal?" Lu Feng glanced at the sparse crowd on the road. "Close the city gate. Gather in District 5. The young judge responded, "Colonel, be careful." Lu Feng didn't speak, slammed the car door shut, started the engine, and fiercely turned the steering wheel. The black car quickly turned around and sped towards the direction of the dispersion center like an arrow released from the bow. Following closely were Howard's car and the city defense office's heavy armor. The researcher in the backseat, holding a communicator, was talking to someone. "We are heading to the dispersion center. Be prepared for the worst." Currently suspecting, special frequency bands for repelling arthropods and crows, attracted worms. But we do not rule out that this is a premeditated attack. Meanwhile, in the city areas, the continuous, shrill and unchanging sound was deafening. Upon hearing it, people on the streets ran towards the nearest buildings. Just because everyone understands that the continuous ringing means emergency shelter. Boss Shao teases Little Mushroom again, and the origin of the 10-day trial is about to be revealed. Last episode, due to the invasion of the city defense by foreign species, Anja, the poet, and Boss Shao were relocated to a nearby residential area. The 3 were locked in the same house, as the city defense was too busy to attend to them. Since they were not very harmful, there were no soldiers guarding them, only the door was locked. The poet, looking out the window, muttered to himself, "Remote management of all dispersal devices at the dispersal center, in the air outdoors. Even a tiny insect might infect humans. The base uses special frequency ultrasound to disperse them, ensuring residents' safety. For insects in breeding season, human flesh is the best incubator for their eggs." Anja, sitting on the bare bed, couldn't help but ask upon hearing this, what would happen? The poet pinched the back of his neck and said, "Suppose last night a small bug merged with your genes. In no more than 3 days, you would be nothing more than a skin bag, filled with hundreds of millions of insect eggs, ready to burst open, sucking living beings dry, spreading to others, very soon." The poet wanted to continue, but was interrupted by Boss Shao. "Don't scare the kid." Anja vividly recalled the foreign species that had its belly cut open at the supply battle square that day, its abdomen and respiratory tract full of insects. And Jay continued to ask, "What should we do?" The poet shook his head, his expression becoming unusually serious. "All we can do is pray that nothing major has happened at the dispersal center, or that it just happened not long ago and the dispersal ritual can still be repaired. Otherwise," at this point, the poet suddenly stopped. After sighing, he continued, "Otherwise, Judgment Day will come again." Mr. Shao was surprised to hear this. "You know about Judgment Day?" The poet simply indicated that he had heard a little about it. Mr. Shao fell silent for a while before speaking again. "I thought that as long as we stay honest in the base, we could live to a ripe old age." The poet still looked out the window, as if in lamentation. He replied, "The base has been safe for too long. I always forget that safety is only temporary. Being alive is not something we're entitled to." And Jay was somewhat confused, but at this moment, he only wanted to ask one question: what is Judgment Day? Mr. Shao turned to him. I forgot to ask you, what's with your clothes? And Jay was at a loss for words. He didn't want to answer this question. But Mr. Shao squinted as if he had just remembered something. Last night, when I was in the tent with the poet, where were you? Were you sleeping with him? And Jay's head hung even lower. No, he didn't sleep. Mr. Shao laughed. Hey, how do you know he didn't sleep? You did sleep with him, how was it? Tell me. And Jay knew he couldn't argue with anyone and could only feign ignorance. He looked at the poet and asked again what Judgment Day is. The poet didn't answer directly but instead asked him if he knew how the Judge's Act was proposed. And Jay shook his head. The poet looked at Mr. Shao. The old gentleman must know. Mr. Shao raised his eyebrows. Of course, I do. Everyone supported the act. The poet's face was very calm, and when he spoke, there was a kind of drawn-out cadence. The Judgment Act has been in place for nearly 100 years. I think the northern base is very grateful for it. I don't know much about it. There are too few elders in the base. Boss Shao's interest finally shifted away from Jay's sleeping habits. After closing his eyes to recall for a moment, he slowly said, I also heard people talk about it when I was a child. After the southeast base was destroyed, everyone was very scared. At that time, the mutation level of the alien species was not as severe as it is now. Boss Shao explained the origin of the 10-day judgment. The cruelty of Judgment Day frightened everyone. In Boss Shao's memory, after the southeast base was destroyed, everyone was very scared. At that time, the mutation level of the alien species was not as severe as it is now. People outside the base had to undergo a full body check before returning. As long as there were no wounds or other abnormalities, it was fine. Every place in the base had soldiers. As soon as a mutation was found, it was immediately killed. The ultrasonic disperser hadn't been invented yet. Bugs flew everywhere in the base. The soldiers killed all the obviously mutated ones. The small ones couldn't be caught, so the base was filled with bug-catching lamps. Miners were not allowed to leave the base and were organized into bug-catching teams to kill insects everywhere. At this point, Boss Shao seemed to remember something amusing and couldn't help but smile. I was even the captain of a bug-catching team when I was a kid. It was only after more than 10 years that the ultrasonic disperser was invented. No bugs could fly into the base. The poet suddenly spoke at this time. The Judgment Act had already been enacted by then. Boss Shao confirmed this but stated that the act was not enacted because of the bugs but because of a surveillance video. A surveillance officer was routinely checking past footage of the water tower when he saw something happening in a corner. The location was too dark, and the footage was not very clear, so no one noticed at the time. But the moment he saw the footage, the surveillance officer went crazy with fear. He saw a person in a very strange posture walking to the recycling purification pool. That person's figure looked like a human-shaped leech. When sitting by the pool, his whole body was like it had no bones. Then he put his leg into the pool. Next, his leg turned into a translucent, whitish substance that exploded, spreading out in the water. That scene is indescribable with words. After that, his entire body flowed into the pool. The water level in the pool immediately rose by more than 10 points. According to those who saw the video, it looked like it was filled with white minced meat. And that water was part of the base's water circulation system. These bits of meat flowed out through the outlet with the water. That was the base's drinking water. The worst news was that this video was from more than 20 hours ago. The poet's brow furrowed, his Adam's apple moving up and down as if feeling nauseous. The whole city is exposed. Boss Shao nodded. Yes, the lighthouse conducted the research. Spreading into the water might be a form of reproduction. In short, the entire base is at risk of infection. No one is safe. Then, the Emergency Act was immediately introduced. The poet then said, there is a theory that the first-generation judges and the tribunal do not belong to the military but are subordinate to the lighthouse. Boss Shao did not refute this because, after the aquatic species invasion, some scientists from the lighthouse had been studying humanoid alien forms. They are quite knowledgeable about these features. They formed the tribunal and spent 10 days organizing everyone in the base to undergo inspection one by one. No one had wounds, but anyone could be infected. There were no inspection methods, it was all based on visual observation and intuition. Even if you did nothing but drink a sip of water, if the tribunal wanted you dead, you would die. At this point, Boss Shao finally sighed. Those 10 days were truly rivers of blood. They say half of the entire base died. The poet bowed his head, recalling carefully, and after a long while, he spoke softly. It's similar to the information I gathered before. Those 10 days are the legendary Judgment Day. The insect swarm descends. Little Mushroom unexpectedly gets infected? In the last episode, Boss Shao told the poet and Anja about the origin of the Judge Act. After hearing it, the poet was silent for a long time before saying, it's similar to the information I gathered before. Those 10 days are the legendary Judgment Day. Boss Shao frowned. It's because of people like you who play with pens. Always mysteriously saying those 10 days are Judgment Day, talking about God and stuff. The poet smiled slightly and then explained, on the last day, all people will stand before God for judgment, either to heaven or to hell, that is Judgment Day. Boss Shao flicked the dust off his cuff. Who knows, when the Virginia base heard about it, they cursed our base's decision. They sent a scientific team, brought machines with scientific evidence to identify the aliens, and spread flyers everywhere with drones, and the result? The poet's voice lowered. Less than a year later, humanoid marine aliens invaded. The Virginia base was fully infected, declared fallen. As soon as the poet finished speaking, Boss Shao continued, though his tone seemed sadder, with those fools from Virginia as a contrast. The Judicator Act was formally introduced. Any judge can shoot to kill at any time. If the judge can't decide, the Judicator has full authority. No responsibility for wrongful killings. The Judicator is like God. But God easily goes mad, kills too many compatriots, and can't stop. The scientists responsible for judgment at the lighthouse changed one after another. In 10 years, 3 went mad and 2 committed suicide. No one wanted to take over, so the military took over. Military personnel stationed in the wilderness all year round, see many monsters, have strong ability to distinguish aliens, and good psychological quality. The turnover rate of judicators finally changed from one going mad every 3 years to one every 10 years. Lu Feng became a judicator when he was not even 20. I bet he wouldn't last 3 years. But this year is already the 7th year. Hubbard said he killed several times more people than the previous judicator, and the number doubled every year in the past 3 years. Everyone knows he's close to going mad. The poet leaned against the wall, paused, and continued. The burden on those from the Central State and the armored ones is hard to say who bears more. But Colonel Lu still has the mood to sleep with kids. It seems he is far from losing control. But then he changed his tone. No, wait, for someone as cold and ruthless as Colonel Lu. This might be one of the signs of going mad. He turned to look at Anja, his eyes showing a similar expression to Boss Shao's. How is he? Did he hurt you? Anja didn't answer, just wrapped his clothes tighter and curled up in the corner, seeming a bit introverted due to the question. But at this moment, a pop sound came from outside the window, startling everyone inside as they all looked towards the source of the noise. A colorful beetle hit the window glass, its tail dragging a long, soft antenna. The poet gently traced his hand over the glass, his voice soft and gentle. It's okay, it's sealed. It can't get in. Mr. Shao looked somewhat skeptical and pointed at the beetle, complaining, each generation is worse than the last, getting uglier. The poet explained, this is due to the fusion of genes. The more bizarre the appearance, the stronger the infective ability. A scientist once said, in the past 100 years, all human research still can't explain the principle of infection. Hearing this explanation, Mr. Shao became even more frightened and shrank back. Diane, can't you just draw the curtains? The poet looked melancholy. I want to look at this city a bit longer, this city whose days might be numbered. Anja looked out following the sound. In the early morning, as the dawn light shone, the fog in the city gradually dissipated, revealing massive mechanical structures at the edge of the horizon. Humans always have many bizarre devices to ensure the safety of the base, but sometimes they are not enough, like now. You don't seem scared at all. The poet's voice interrupted Anja's reverie. He turned to look at him, at a loss for words. The poet let go of the curtain in his hand. You really are strange, Anja replied blankly. Really? The poet leaned against the table with his arms crossed. You're too quiet, as if it doesn't matter what happens next. We rarely see people with your kind of personality these days. Hearing this, Anja couldn't help but laugh. Maybe mushrooms and humans must have some differences. I'm trying to be more like a human. So he looked up at the poet and asked, what do we do now? The poet told him that now they could only pray that the ultrasonic disperser wasn't completely damaged. We can only hope that the ultrasonic disperser isn't completely damaged, or that the bugs are just a bunch of brainless creatures acting on instinct. Alternatively, we can pray that the glass is strong enough and won't shatter easily. Just as he finished speaking, the next second, a series of thudding sounds hit the window. It was the noise of countless flying insects crashing into the glass. Boss Shao's face darkened. I pray you're an idiot. The poet was also panicked, quickly pulling back a corner of the curtain before closing it again. Don't look. The moment after Boss Shao said this, his expression changed drastically. The vent, quick, block the vent. And Jay also saw it. The vent was right above his head. The poet immediately tore off his sleeve and handed it to Njay. Use this to block it for now. But after trying, Njay found that the vent was too large, and the fabric the poet gave was not enough. So the poet tore off another piece, and Njay held the original piece with one hand. With his other hand, he took the new fabric from the poet. But the next moment, he felt a sharp pain in the hand he had placed in the vent. And Jay paused for a moment, then, with a calm expression, stuffed the new piece of fabric into the vent. He then sat back on the bed frame, while Boss Shao and the poet checked the room for other vulnerabilities. And Jay raised his palm and put his index finger in front of his eyes. Seeing a needle-sized red dot appear on the fingertip. A bug outbreak occurred, and Boss Shao became a little mushroom, accelerating the relationship with Colonel Liu. Last episode mentioned that the outer city of the base was attacked by a bug invasion, and Jay was stung by a bug while blocking the vent. Looking at the needle-sized red dot on his fingertip, his skin started to change, turning into snow-white mycelium. Then, while Boss Shao and the poet had their backs turned, he forcefully pulled, and new mycelium extended from the broken part, reforming into an uninjured human finger. And Jay looked at this newly formed finger. He didn't know if this would work. The pulled mycelium didn't show any problems, but he had no other options. At this moment, the poet turned around and told him that all the holes in the room were blocked. And Jay responded softly. But the next moment, the sound of insects hitting the window became more intense, as if they wouldn't stop until the glass was shattered. The poet sat down, his face slightly pale. They're hitting harder and harder. The rest is up to fate. Boss Shao heard this and shouted at him, "Shut up." Then he turned his head to look at Anja. And Jay was a bit confused. "What's wrong?" Boss Shao pointed at him. "Quick, call your man." And Jay was speechless at this. At the other dispersal center, a huge black dispersal device stands under the gray-white sky. Its disc-shaped body makes it look like a flower blooming in the city. The car speeds along the road, buildings receding in the background. Finally, Lu Han speaks up. "If the dispersal center is breached, will the other dispersers still function?" A researcher tells him they might stop working, then falls silent. After a while, he continues, "The operations at the dispersal center are too complex. The intensity and frequency of all dispersers are remotely controlled by the center. If the hub is breached, the consequences may be severe, though the likelihood of this happening is very small. Disperser number 1 at the dispersal center is the largest in the outer city. Its power and radiation levels are too high, which is why there are no permanent residents in Zone 1. The dispersal center has few personnel and troops. With insufficient manpower, there might be temporary loss of contact for other reasons, not necessarily." At this point, the researcher abruptly stops talking. He looks forward in horror. Through the car window, he immediately spots the flower in the city, now crawling with various insects. The researcher's breathing becomes violently shaky. "Colonel, do you see that?" Lu Han doesn't reply but instead grips the steering wheel and turns sharply. The car makes an extremely risky turn and heads back in the direction they came from. Several armored vehicles behind, reacting a bit slower, are instantly surrounded by countless flying insects the moment they spot the disperser. The black swarm explodes in the air like fireworks. The volume on the car's communicator is turned to the maximum. The operator's trembling voice comes through, "Colonel, Zone 2 emergency communication. Full outbreak of the insect tide. Requesting support. Zone 3 emergency communication. A large number of insect-type monsters discovered during the evacuation process. Requesting support." Soon after, emergency communications from the City Defense Office, City Affairs Office, and various districts come in. Lu Han's expression remains unchanged, but he speaks much faster than usual. "Connect to Zone 8, underground shelter. Can you safely accommodate all city residents for emergency evacuation?" The response comes even quicker. "Colonel Liu, small flying ant groups have entered through the ventilation system. We have more than 10 infected here. Requesting support from the tribunal." After a few seconds of silence, Lu Han replies, "Eliminate the infected. Other personnel should take shelter and wait for support." The little mushroom asked Colonel Liu for help. One phone call made the usually composed colonel panic. In the last episode, the insect tide broke out completely. Emergency communications came from various regions, and more than 10 infected people appeared at the connection points. Upon learning of this, Lu Feng immediately ordered the infected to be shot, and the others to take refuge and wait for support. After saying that, he hung up the communication. The next second, the communicator rang again with a young voice, "Colonel, the tribunal has assembled. There are no casualties at the moment." Lu Feng immediately gave the order, "Disperse to support each area. Priority to Area 8. After the young man took the order, the communicator was hung up again. In the car, the researcher tried to stay calm. "Colonel, let's return to the main city." Lu Feng was puzzled, so the researcher explained again, "The main city has an independent defense and dispersal system. It can guarantee absolute safety." The car gradually slowed down. Lu Feng's voice remained indifferent. "What about the outer city?" The researcher's voice became anxious. "The outer city is completely exposed. The insect monsters have the advantage in size. The danger level of the insect tide You are the judge, but in this situation, you can't save anyone. Going anywhere is meaningless. You can't reduce any casualties. You can't protect others, but you can save ourselves. The communicator rang again, but this time it wasn't the operator's voice. Colonel, a clear voice sounded, slower than Lu Feng was used to, with a soft tone. Your item is still with me. Lu Feng didn't say much and directly asked the other party's location. And Jay replied, City Defense Office. There are many bugs hitting the glass next to me. When he said this, his voice was noticeably trembling, seeming scared. Lu Feng turns the steering wheel half a circle, driving towards one of the forked roads. The researcher looks at the abandoned fork, his expression changes, and he almost jumps out of his seat, thankfully restrained by the seatbelt. He suddenly speaks out. Colonel, you. Lu Han acts as if he hears nothing, self-absorbedly picks up the communicator and then replies to Njay with, wait. In a residential building in another district, Njay, the poet, and boss Shao, the three of them, stay quietly in the room. The poet suddenly realizes that the sound of insects hitting the glass outside is gradually decreasing until it completely disappears. Just as he begins to wonder, a series of hurried footsteps are heard at the door. Njay glances over, his expression unknowingly becomes tense. The door is suddenly swung open. The first thing that catches his eye is a pair of black leather boots, a style he has seen before. They are the uniform of the tribunal. When Lu sees the three people, his emotions do not fluctuate, at least that's how it appears. He quickly walks towards Njay on the bed. Then, he covers Njay's head with the outer jacket of the uniform and takes him out. A new round of Judgment Day is about to begin. What will be the fate of the little mushroom bitten by insects? In the previous episode, Lu learned that Njay was in danger. No longer caring about anything else, Rui directly opened the door and took Njay and the others out. At the entrance of the building, Lu Feng had placed a small dispersal device. Within a few miles, it was temporarily safe. After being shoved into the car, the poet and boss Shao squeezed in as well, the three of them crowded in the back seat. Lu Han glanced over from the driver's seat and said lightly, overloaded. Njay inexplicably felt that the judge was targeting him again. Fortunately, boss Shao spoke up, report, Colonel, I am not a human. Not overloaded, he said. Lu Feng said no more and dialed Howard's communication. Director Howard, he said, the ultrasonic disruption device rescue plan is feasible. I suggest organizing a large-scale evacuation of residents. From the other end of the communicator came Howard's voice confirming again. Evacuate to the underground shelters? Lu Feng replied, I'll first go to the shelter in Zone 8 to confirm its safety. Thanks, the communication ended, and Lu Feng immediately started the engine. After making a turn, the car headed towards Zone 8. Along the way, Lu Feng's communicator kept ringing. First, there was a distress signal from the City Affairs Office. The next second, Zone 5 requested support. The tribunal also reported a shortage of personnel. In the end, Lu Feng's replies became very mechanical, directing all calls to the City Defense Office. Until Howard's angry voice came through, he subconsciously hung up the communication. After hanging up, Lu Feng furrowed his brows slightly and asked the researcher next to him, did I receive a communication from Zone 6? The researcher said there should have been none. Lu Feng dialed the number. Hello, this is District 6 Municipal Office. May I ask? The operator's tone was very calm. This calmness, compared to all previous communicators, seemed somewhat out of place. Lu Feng frowned, feeling it more deeply. Courtroom, Lu Feng speaking. What's the situation in District 6? The other side paused for a moment. Everything is normal in District 6. May I ask what? Lu Han interrupted again. Everything is normal? The operator firmly replied, yes, and Lu Han abruptly hung up the communication. The researcher was initially stunned. Then he became excited. There's only one explanation, the ultrasonic disperser in District 6. The emergency procedure was successfully initiated. Lu Feng called back again. Please confirm again. Please confirm the disperser is working properly. The operator confidently replied, I confirm everything is normal. Colonel, is there a problem? Yes, Lu Feng answered succinctly and directly. Immediately raise the isolation wall. Confirm the supply of materials. Prepare for emergency containment. The operator acknowledged. Following that, Lu Feng contacted Howard. Howard, the situation has changed. The whole city is to take refuge in District 6. Okay, the other side said, City Defense is in charge of personnel. Rescue and relocation. Received, court in charge of personnel screening. After this communication ended, Lu Feng dialed another number. Anja noticed that this sequence of numbers was unusually short. Main City, Unified Combat Center. Hello, Colonel Lu. Lu Feng replied, courtroom. Lu Han, requesting citywide judicial authority. The voice on the other end didn't hesitate much. Please provide the expected mortality rate and duration of execution. Lu Feng suddenly fell silent. Several seconds later, he replied again, 60%. 5 days. After receiving the response, the Unified Combat Center asked him to wait for a moment. However, the poet sitting in the backseat looked distressed at this moment and muttered, Citywide judgment. Isn't this just? Mr. Shao, the shop owner, looked straight ahead and finished the poet's sentence, Judgment Day.